Classic science fiction stories, read by Nikki Henson. The Disintegration Machine, by Arthur Conan Doyle. Professor Challenger was in the worst possible humor. As I stood at the door of his study, my hand upon the handle and my foot upon the mat, I heard a monologue which ran like this, the words booming and reverberating through the house.
Yes, I say it is the second wrong call, the second in one morning. Do you imagine that a man of science is to be distracted from essential work by the constant interference of some idiot at the end of a wire? I will not have it. Send this instant for the manager.
Oh, you are the manager.
Well, why don't you manage? Yes, you certainly manage to distract me from work, the importance of which your mind is incapable of understanding. I want the superintendent. He is away, so I should imagine. I will carry you to the law courts if this occurs again. Crowing cocks have been adjudicated upon. I myself have obtained a judgment. If crowing cocks, why not jangling bells? The case is clear. A written apology? Very good. I will consider it. Good morning.
It was at this point that I ventured to make my entrance. It was certainly an unfortunate moment. I confronted him as he turned from the telephone, a lion in its wrath. His huge black beard was bristling. His great chest was heaving with indignation, and his arrogant grey eyes swept me up and down as the backwash of his anger fell upon me.
Infernal, idle, overpaid rascals, he boomed. I could hear them laughing while I was making my just complaint. There is a conspiracy to annoy me, and now, young Malone, you arrive to a complete disastrous morning. Are you here, may I ask, on your own account, or has your rag commissioned you to obtain an interview? As a friend, you are privileged, but as a journalist, you are outside the pale.
I was hunting in my pocket for McArdle's letter when suddenly some new grievance came to his memory. His great hairy hands fumbled about among the papers upon his desk and finally extracted a press cutting.
You have been good enough to allude to me in one of your recent lucubrations, he said, shaking the paper at me. It was in the course of your somewhat fatuous remarks concerning the recent saurian remains discovered in the Zollenhofen slates. You began a paragraph with the words, Professor G.E. Challenger, who is among our greatest living scientists.
Well, sir, I asked.
Why these invidious qualifications and limitations? Perhaps you can mention who these other predominant scientific men may be to whom you impute equality, or possibly superiority to myself.
It was badly worded. I should certainly have said, our greatest living scientist, I admitted. It was, after all, my own honest belief. My words turned winter into summer.
My dear young friend, do not imagine that I am exacting, but surrounded as I am by pugnacious and unreasonable colleagues, one is forced to take one's own part. Self-assertion is foreign to my nature, but I have to hold my ground against opposition. Come now, sit here. What is the reason of your visit?
I had to tread warily, for I knew how easy it was to set the lion roaring once again. I opened McArdle's letter. May I read you this, sir? It is from McArdle, my editor.
I remember the man. Not an unfavourable specimen of his class.
He has at least a very high admiration for you. He has turned to you again and again when he needed the highest qualities in some investigation. That is the case now.
What does he desire?
Challenger plumed himself like some unwieldy bird under the influence of flattery. He sat down with his elbows upon the desk, his gorilla hands clasped together, his beard bristling forward, and his big grey eyes, half covered by his drooping lids, fixed benignly upon me. He was huge in all that he did, and his benevolence was even more overpowering than his truculence. I'll read you this note to me. He says, Please call upon our esteemed friend, Professor Challenger, and ask for his cooperation in the following circumstances. There is a Latvian gentleman named Theodore Nemo living at Whitefriars Mansions, Hampstead, who claims to have invented a machine of a most extraordinary character which is capable of disintegrating any object placed within its sphere of influence. Matter dissolves and returns to its molecular or atomic condition. By reversing the process, it can be reassembled. The claim seems to be an extravagant one, and yet there is solid evidence that there is some basis for it, and that the man has stumbled upon some remarkable discovery. I need not enlarge upon the revolutionary character of such an invention, nor of its extreme importance as a potential weapon of war. A force which could disintegrate a battleship or turn a battalion, if it were only for a time, into a collection of atoms, would dominate the world. For social and for political reasons, not an instant is to be lost in getting to the bottom of the affair. The man courts publicity as he is anxious to sell his invention, so there is no difficulty in approaching him. The enclosed card will open his doors. What I desire is that you and Professor Challenger shall call upon him, inspect his invention, and write for the Gazette a considered report upon the value of the discovery. I expect to hear from you tonight. R. McCardle. There are my instructions, Professor, I added as I refolded the letter. I sincerely hope that you will come with me, for how can I, with my limited capacities, act alone in such a matter? True, Malone, true, purred the great man. Though you are by no means destitute of natural intelligence, I agree with you that you would be somewhat overweighted in such a matter as you lay before me. These unutterable people upon the telephone have already ruined my morning's work, so that a little more can hardly matter. I am engaged in answering the Italian buffoon Mazzotti, whose views upon the larval development of the tropical termites had excited my derision and contempt, but I can leave the complete exposure of the impostor until evening. Meanwhile, I am at your service. And thus it came about that on that October morning I found myself in the deep level tube with the Professor speeding to the north of London in what proved to be one of the most singular experiences of my remarkable life. I had, before leaving Enmore Gardens, ascertained by the much-abused telephone that our man was at home and had warned him of our coming. He lived in a comfortable flat in Hampstead, and he kept us waiting for quite half an hour in his anteroom, whilst he carried on an animated conversation with a group of visitors whose voices, as they finally bade farewell in the hall, showed that they were Russians. I caught a glimpse of them through the half-open door, and had a passing impression of prosperous and intelligent men with astrakhan collars to their coats, glistening top hats, and every appearance of that bourgeois well-being which the successful communist so readily assumes. The hall door closed behind them, and the next instant Theodore Nemo entered our apartment. I can see him now as he stood with the sunlight full upon him, rubbing his long, thin hands together and surveying us with his broad smile and his cunning yellow eyes. He was a short, thick man with some suggestion of deformity in his body, though it was difficult to say where that suggestion lay. One might say that he was a hunchback without the hump. His large, soft face was like an underdone dumpling of the same colour and moist consistency, while the pimples and blotches which adorned it stood out the more aggressively against the pallid background. His eyes were those of a cat, and cat-like was the thin, long, bristling moustache above his loose, wet, slobbering mouth. It was all low and repulsive until one came to the sandy eyebrows. From these upwards there was a splendid cranial arch, such as I have seldom seen. Even Challenger's hat might have fitted that magnificent head. One might read Theodore Nemo as a vile, crawling conspirator below, but above he might take rank with the great thinkers and philosophers of the world. "Well, gentlemen," he said in a velvety voice, with only the least trace of a foreign accent, "you have come, as I understand from our short chat over the wires, in order to learn more of the Nemo disintegrator. Is it not so?" "Exactly." "May I ask whether you represent the British government?" "Not at all. I am a correspondent of the Gazette, and this is Professor Challenger." "An honoured name. A European name." His yellow fangs gleamed in obsequious amiability. "I was about to say that the British government has lost its chance. What else it has lost it may find out later. Possibly its empire as well. I was prepared to sell to the first government which gave me its price, and if it has now fallen into hands of which you may disapprove, you have only yourselves to blame." "Then you have sold your secret?" "At my own price." "You think the purchaser will have a monopoly?" "Undoubtedly he will." "But others know the secret as well as you." "No, sir." He touched his great forehead. "This is the safe in which the secret is securely locked. A better safe than any of steel, and secured by something better than a Yale key. Some may know one side of the matter, others may know another, but no one in the world knows the whole matter, save only I." "And these gentlemen to whom you have sold it?" "No, sir. I am not so foolish as to hand over the knowledge until the price is paid. After that, it is I whom they buy, and they move this safe, he again tapped his brow, with all its contents to whatever point they desire. My part of the bargain will then be done, faithfully, ruthlessly done. After that, history will be made. He rubbed his hands together, and the fixed smile upon his face twisted itself into something like a snarl.
"You will excuse me, sir," boomed Challenger, who had sat in silence up to now, but whose expressive face registered most complete disapproval of Theodore Nemo. "We should wish before we discuss the matter to convince ourselves that there is something to discuss. We have not forgotten a recent case where an Italian who proposed to explode mines from a distance proved upon investigation to be an arrant impostor. History may well repeat itself. You will understand, sir, that I have a reputation to sustain as a man of science, a reputation which you have been good enough to describe as European, though I have every reason to believe that it is not less conspicuous in America. Caution is a scientific attribute, and you must show us your proofs before we can seriously consider your claims."
Nemo cast a particularly malignant glance from the yellow eyes at my companion, but the smile of affected geniality broadened upon his face. "You live up to your reputation, Professor. I'd always heard that you were the last man in the world who could be deceived. I am prepared to give you an actual demonstration which cannot fail to convince you. But before we proceed to that, I must say a few words upon the general principle. You will realize that the experimental plant which I have erected here in my laboratory is a mere model, though within its limits it acts most admirably. There would be no possible difficulty, for example, in disintegrating you and reassembling you, but it is not for such a purpose as that a great government is prepared to pay a price which runs into millions. My model is a mere scientific toy. It is only when the same force is invoked upon a large scale that enormous practical effects could be achieved."
"May we see this model?"
"You will not only see it, Professor Challenger, but you will have the most conclusive demonstration possible upon your own person, if you have the courage to submit to it."
"If?" the lion began to roar. "Your if, sir, is in the highest degree offensive."
Well, I had no intention to dispute your courage. I will only say that I will give you an opportunity to demonstrate it. But I would first say a few words upon the underlying laws which govern the matter. When certain crystals, salt for example, or sugar, are placed in water, they dissolve and disappear. You would not know that they had ever been there. Then, by evaporation or otherwise, you lessen the amount of water, and lo, there are your crystals again, visible once more, and the same as before. Can you conceive a process by which you, an organic being, are in the same way dissolved into the cosmos, and then by a subtle reversal of the conditions are reassembled once more?
"The analogy is a false one," cried Challenger. "Even if I make so monstrous an admission as that our molecules could be dispersed by some disrupting power, why should they reassemble in exactly the same order as before?"
The objection is an obvious one, and I can only answer that they do so reassemble down to the last atom of the structure. There is an invisible framework, and every brick flies into its true place. You may smile, Professor, but your incredulity and your smile may soon be replaced by quite another emotion.
Challenger shrugged his shoulders. "I'm quite ready to submit to the test."
There is another case which I would impress upon you, gentlemen, and which may help you to grasp the idea. You have heard both in Oriental magic and in Western occultism of the phenomenon of apport, when some object is suddenly brought from a distance and appears in a new place. How can such a thing be done, save by the loosening of the molecules, their conveyance upon an etheric wave, and their reassembling, each exactly in its own place, drawn together by some irresistible law? That seems a fair analogy to that which is done by my machine.
"You cannot explain one incredible thing by quoting another incredible thing," said Challenger. "I do not believe in your apport, Mr. Nemo, and I do not believe in your machine. My time is valuable, and if we are to have any sort of demonstration, I would beg you to proceed with it without further ceremony."
"Then you will be pleased to follow me," said the inventor. He led us down the stair of the flat and across a small garden which lay behind. There was a considerable outhouse, which he unlocked, and we entered. Inside was a large whitewashed room with innumerable copper wires hanging in festoons from the ceiling, and a huge magnet balanced upon a pedestal. In front of this was what looked like a prism of glass, 3 feet in length and about a foot in diameter. To the right of it was a chair which rested upon a platform of zinc and which had a burnished copper cap suspended above it. Both the cap and the chair had heavy wires attached to them, and at the side was a sort of ratchet with numbered slots and a handle covered with India rubber, which lay at present in a slot marked 0. "Nemours disintegrator," said this strange man, waving his hand toward the machine. "This is the model which is destined to be famous as altering the balance of power among the nations. Who holds this rules the world. Now, Professor Challenger, you have, if I may say so, treated me with some lack of courtesy and consideration in this matter. Will you dare to sit upon that chair and to allow me to demonstrate upon your own body the capabilities of the new force?" Challenger had the courage of a lion, and anything in the nature of a defiance roused him in an instant to a frenzy. He rushed at the machine, but I seized his arm and held him back. "You shall not go," I said. "Your life is too valuable. It is monstrous. What possible guarantee of safety have you?" The nearest approach to that apparatus which I have ever seen was the electrocution chair at Sing Sing. "My guarantee of safety," said Challenger, "is that you are a witness, and that this person would certainly be held for manslaughter at the least, should anything befall me." "That would be a poor consolation to the world of science, when you would leave work unfinished which none but you can do. Let me at least go first, and then when the experience proves to be harmless, you can follow." Personal danger would never have moved Challenger, but the idea that his scientific work might remain unfinished hit him hard. He hesitated, and before he could make up his mind, I dashed forward and jumped into the chair. I saw the inventor put his hand to the handle. I was aware of a click. Then for a moment there was a sensation of confusion and a mist before my eyes. When they cleared, the inventor, with his odious smile, was standing before me, and Challenger, with his apple-red cheeks drained of blood and colour, was staring over his shoulder. "Well, get on with it," said I. "It is all over. You responded admirably," Nemours replied. "Step out, and Professor Challenger will now no doubt be ready to take his turn." I've never seen my old friend so utterly upset. His iron nerve had for a moment completely failed him. He grasped my arm with a shaking hand. "My God, Malone, it's true," said he. "You vanished. There is not a doubt of it. There was a mist for an instant, and then vacancy." "How long was I away?" 2 or 3 minutes. I was, I confess, horrified. I could not imagine that you would return. Then he clicked this lever, if it is a lever, into a new slot, and there you were, upon the chair, looking a little bewildered, but otherwise the same as ever. I thanked God at the sight of you." He mopped his moist brow with his big red handkerchief. "Now, sir," said the inventor, "or perhaps your nerve has failed you?" Challenger visibly braced himself. Then, pushing my protesting hand to one side, he seated himself upon the chair. The handle clicked into number 3, and he was gone. I should have been horrified but for the perfect coolness of the operator. "It is an interesting process, is it not?" he remarked. "When one considers the tremendous individuality of the professor, it is strange to think that he is at present a molecular cloud suspended in some portion of this building. He is now, of course, entirely at my mercy. If I choose to leave him in suspension, there is nothing on earth to prevent me." "I would very soon find means to prevent you." The smile once again became a snarl. "You cannot imagine that such a thought ever entered my mind. Good heavens, think of the permanent dissolution of the great Professor Challenger, vanished into cosmic space and left no trace. Terrible, terrible. At the same time, he has not been as courteous as he might. Don't you think some small lesson?" "No, I do not." "Well, we will call it a curious demonstration, something that would make an interesting paragraph in your paper. For example, I have discovered that the hair of the body, being on an entirely different vibration to the living organic tissues, can be included or excluded at will. It would interest me to see the great bear without his bristles. Behold him." There was a click of the lever. An instant later, Challenger was seated upon the chair once more. But what a Challenger! What a shorn lion! Furious as I was at the trick that had been played upon him, I could hardly keep from roaring with laughter. His huge head was as bald as a baby's, and his chin was as smooth as a girl's. Bereft of his glorious mane, the lower part of his face was heavily jowled and ham-shaped, while his whole appearance was that of an old fighting gladiator, battered and bulging with the jaws of a bulldog over a massive chin. It may have been some look upon our faces. I have no doubt that the evil grin of my companion had widened at the sight. But however that may be, Challenger's hand flew up to his head, and he became conscious of his condition. The next instant, he had sprung out of his chair, seized the inventor by the throat, and had hurled him to the ground. Knowing Challenger's immense strength, I was convinced that the man would be killed. "For God's sake, be careful! If you kill him, we can never get matters right again," I cried. That argument prevailed. Even in his maddest moments, Challenger was always open to reason. He sprang up from the floor, dragging the trembling inventor with him. "I give you 5 minutes," he panted in his fury. "If in 5 minutes I am not as I was, I will choke the life out of your wretched little body." Challenger in a fury was not a safe person to argue with. The bravest man might shrink from him, and there were no signs that Mr. Nemore was a particularly brave man. On the contrary, those blotches and warts upon his face had suddenly become much more conspicuous as the face behind them changed from the colour of putty, which was normal, to that of a fish's belly. His limbs were shaking, and he could hardly articulate. "Really, Professor," he babbled with his hand to his throat, "this violence is quite unnecessary. Surely a harmless joke may pass among friends. It was my wish to demonstrate the powers of the machine. I had imagined that you wanted a full demonstration. No offense, I assure you, Professor, none in the world." For answer, Challenger climbed back into the chair. "You will keep your eye upon him, Malone. Do not permit any liberties." "I'll see to it, sir." "Now then, set that matter right, or take the consequences." The terrified inventor approached his machine. The reuniting power was turned on to the full, and in an instant, there was the old lion with his tangled mane once more. He stroked his beard affectionately with his hands, and passed them over his cranium to be sure that the restoration was complete. Then he descended solemnly from his perch. "You have taken a liberty, sir, which might have had very serious consequences to yourself. However, I am content to accept your explanation that you only did it for purposes of demonstration. Now, may I ask you a few direct questions about this remarkable power which you claim to have discovered?" "I am ready to answer anything save what the source of the power is. That is my secret." "And do you seriously inform us that no one in the world knows this except yourself?" "No one has the least inkling." "No assistants?" "No, sir. I work alone." "Dear me, that is most interesting. You have satisfied me as to the reality of the power, but I do not yet perceive its practical bearings." "I have explained, sir, that this is a model, but it would be quite easy to erect a plant upon a large scale. You understand that this acts vertically. Certain currents above you and certain others below you set up vibrations which either disintegrate or reunite, but the process could be lateral. If it was so conducted, it would have the same effect and cover a space in proportion to the strength of the current." "Give an example." "We will suppose that one pole was in one small vessel and one in another. A battleship between them would simply vanish into molecules. So also with a column of troops." "And you have sold this secret as a monopoly to a single European power?" "Yes, sir, I have. When the money is paid over, they shall have such power as no nation ever had yet. You don't even see now the full possibilities if placed in capable hands, hands which did not fear to wield the weapon which they held. They are immeasurable." A gloating smile passed over the man's evil face. "Conceive a quarter of London in which such machines have been erected. Imagine the effect of such a current upon the scale which could easily be adopted. Why," he burst into laughter, "I could imagine the whole Thames Valley being swept clean, and not one man, woman, or child left of all these teeming millions." The words filled me with horror, and even more the air of exultation with which they were pronounced. They seemed, however, to produce quite a different effect upon my companion. To my surprise, he broke into a genial smile and held out his hand to the inventor. "Well, Mr. Nemore, we have to congratulate you," said he. "There is no doubt that you have come upon a remarkable property of nature which you have succeeded in harnessing for the use of man.
That this use should be destructive is no doubt very deplorable, but science knows no distinctions of the sort, but follows knowledge wherever it may lead. Apart from the principle involved, you have, I suppose, no objection to my examining the construction of the machine?
None in the least. The machine is merely the body. It is the soul of it, the animating principle which you can never hope to capture.
Exactly. But the mere mechanism seems to be a model of ingenuity.
For some time he walked round it and fingered its several parts. Then he hoisted his unwieldy bulk into the insulated chair.
Would you like another excursion into the cosmos? Asked the inventor.
Later, perhaps, later. But meanwhile, there is, as no doubt you know, some leakage of electricity. I can distinctly feel a weak current passing through me.
Impossible. It is quite insulated.
But I assure you that I feel it.
He levered himself down from his perch. The inventor hastened to take his place.
I can feel nothing.
Is there not a tingling down the spine?
No, sir. I do not observe it.
There was a sharp click, and the man had disappeared. I looked with amazement at Challenger. Good heavens! Did you touch the machine, Professor? He smiled at me benignly with an air of mild surprise.
Oh, dear me. I may have inadvertently touched the handle, said he. One is very liable to have awkward incidents with a rough model of this kind. This lever should certainly be guarded.
It is in number 3. That is the slot which causes disintegration.
So I observed when you were operated upon.
But I was so excited when he brought you back that I did not notice which was the proper slot for the return. Did you notice it?
I may have noticed it, young Malone, but I do not burden my mind with small details. There are many slots, and we do not know their purpose. We may make the matter worse if we experiment with the unknown. Perhaps it is better to leave matters as they are.
And you would...
Exactly. It is better so. The interesting personality of Mr. Theodore Nemor has distributed itself throughout the cosmos. His machine is worthless, and a certain foreign government has been deprived of knowledge by which much harm might have been wrought. Not a bad morning's work, young Malone. Your rag will no doubt have an interesting column upon the inexplicable disappearance of a Latvian inventor shortly after the visit of its own special correspondent. I have enjoyed the experience. These are the lighter moments which come to brighten the dull routine of study. But life has its duties as well as its pleasures, and I now return to the Italian Mazzotti and his preposterous views upon the larval development of the tropical termites.
Looking back, it seemed to me that a slight oleaginous mist was still hovering around the chair. But surely, I urged...
The first duty of the law-abiding citizen is to prevent murder, said Professor Challenger. I have done so. Enough, Malone, enough. The theme will not bear discussion. It has already disengaged my thoughts too long from matters of more importance.
The Clock That Went Backward by Edward Page Mitchell. A row of Lombardy poplars stood in front of my great-aunt Gertrude's house on the bank of the Sheepscot River. In personal appearance, my aunt was surprisingly like one of those trees. She had the look of hopeless anemia that distinguishes them from fuller-blooded sorts. She was tall, severe in outline, and extremely thin. Her habiliments clung to her. I'm sure that, had the gods found occasion to impose upon her the fate of Daphne, she would have taken her place easily and naturally in the dismal row, as melancholy a poplar as the rest. Some of my earliest recollections are of this venerable relative. Alive and dead, she bore an important part in the events I'm about to recount, events which I believe to be without parallel in the experience of mankind. During our periodical visits of duty to Aunt Gertrude in Maine, my cousin Harry and myself were accustomed to speculate much on her age. Was she 60, or was she 60? We had no precise information. She might have been either. The old lady was surrounded by old-fashioned things. She seemed to live altogether in the past. In her short half-hours of communicativeness over her second cup of tea, or on the piazza where the poplars sent slim shadows directly toward the east, she used to tell us stories of her alleged ancestors. I say alleged because we never fully believed that she had ancestors. A genealogy is a stupid thing. Here is Aunt Gertrude's, reduced to its simplest forms. Her great-great-grandmother, 1599 to 1642, was a woman of Holland who married a Puritan refugee and sailed from Leyden to Plymouth in the ship Anne in the year of our Lord 1632. This pilgrim mother had a daughter, Aunt Gertrude's great-grandmother, 1640 to 1718. She came to the Eastern District of Massachusetts in the early part of the last century and was carried off by the Indians in the Penobscot Wars. Her daughter, 1680 to 1776, lived to see these colonies free and independent and contributed to the population of the coming republic not less than 19 stalwart sons and comely daughters. One of the latter, 1735 to 1802, married a Wiscasset skipper, engaged in the West India trade, with whom she sailed. She was twice wrecked at sea, once on what is now Seguin Island and once on San Salvador. It was on San Salvador that Aunt Gertrude was born. We got to be very tired of hearing this family history. Perhaps it was the constant repetition and the merciless persistency with which the above dates were driven into our young ears that made us skeptics. As I have said, we took little stock in Aunt Gertrude's ancestors. They seemed highly improbable. In our private opinion, the great-grandmothers and grandmothers and so forth were pure myths, and Aunt Gertrude herself was the principal in all the adventures attributed to them, having lasted from century to century while generations of contemporaries went the way of all flesh. On the first landing of the square stairway of the mansion loomed a tall Dutch clock. The case was more than 8 feet high, of a dark red wood, not mahogany, and it was curiously inlaid with silver. No common piece of furniture was this. About 100 years ago, there flourished in the town of Brunswick a horologist named Carey, an industrious and accomplished workman. Few well-to-do houses on that part of the coast lacked a Carey timepiece, but Aunt Gertrude's clock had marked the hours and minutes of 2 full centuries before the Brunswick artisan was born. It was running when William the Taciturn pierced the dikes to relieve Leyden. The name of the maker, Jan Lipperdam, and the date, 1572, was still legible in broad black letters and figures reaching quite across the dial. Carey's masterpieces were plebeian and recent besides this ancient aristocrat. The jolly Dutch moon, made to exhibit the phases over a landscape of windmills and polders, was cunningly painted. A skilled hand had carved the grim ornament at the top, a death's head transfixed by a 2-edged sword. Like all timepieces of the 16th century, it had no pendulum. A simple Van Wyck escapement governed the descent of the weights to the bottom of the tall case. But these weights never moved. Year after year, when Harry and I returned to Maine, we found the hands of the old clock pointing to the 3:15, as they had pointed when we first saw them. The fat moon hung perpetually in the 3rd quarter, as motionless as the death's head above. There was a mystery about the silenced movement of the paralyzed hands. Aunt Gertrude told us that the works had never performed their function since a bolt of lightning entered the clock, and she showed us a black hole in the side of the case near the top with a yawning rift that extended downward for several feet. This explanation failed to satisfy us. It did not account for the sharpness of her refusal when we proposed to bring over the watchmaker from the village, or for her singular agitation once when she found Harry on a stepladder with a borrowed key in his hand, about to test for himself the clock's suspended vitality. One August night, after we'd grown out of boyhood, I was awakened by a noise in the hallway. I shook my cousin. "Somebody's in the house," I whispered. We crept out of our room and onto the stairs. A dim light came from below. We held our breath and noiselessly descended to the second landing. Harry clutched my arm. He pointed down over the banisters, at the same time drawing me back into the shadow. We saw a strange thing. Aunt Gertrude stood on a chair in front of the old clock, as spectral in her white nightgown and white nightcap as one of the poplars when covered with snow. It chanced that the floor creaked slightly under our feet. She turned with a sudden movement, peering intently into the darkness and holding a candle high towards us so that the light was full upon her pale face. She looked many years older than when I had bid her good night. For a few minutes she was motionless, except in the trembling arm that held aloft the candle. Then, evidently reassured, she placed the light upon a shelf and turned again to the clock. We now saw the old lady take a key from behind the face and proceed to wind up the weights. We could hear her breath, quick and short. She rested a hand on either side of the case and held her face close to the dial, as if subjecting it to anxious scrutiny. In this attitude she remained for a long time. We heard her utter a sigh of relief, and she half turned towards us for a moment. I shall never forget the expression of wild joy that transfigured her features then. The hands of the clock were moving. They were moving backward. Aunt Gertrude put both arms around the clock and pressed her withered cheeks against it. She kissed it repeatedly. She caressed it in 100 ways, as if it had been a living and beloved thing. She fondled it and talked to it, using words which we could hear but could not understand. The hands continued to move backward. Then she started back with a sudden cry. The clock had stopped. We saw her tall body swaying for an instant on the chair. She stretched out her arms in a convulsive gesture of terror and despair, wrenched the minute hand to its old place at 3:15, and fell heavily to the floor. Aunt Gertrude's will left me her bank and gas stocks, real estate, railroad bonds, and city sevens, and gave Harry the clock. We thought at the time that this was a very unequal division, the more surprising because my cousin had always seemed to be the favorite. Half in seriousness, we made a thorough examination of the ancient timepiece, sounding its wooden case for secret drawers, and even probing the not complicated works with a knitting needle to ascertain if our whimsical relative had bestowed there some codicil or other document changing the aspect of affairs. We discovered nothing. There was testamentary provision for our education at the University of Leyden. We left the military school, in which we had learned a little of the theory of war and a good deal of the art of standing with our noses over our heels, and took ship without delay. The clock went with us. Before many months, it was established in a corner of a room in the Bredestraat. The fabric of Jan Lipperdam's ingenuity, thus restored to its native air, continued to tell the hour of 3:15 with its old fidelity. The author of the clock had been under the sod for nearly 300 years. The combined skill of his successors in the craft at Leyden could make it neither go backward nor forward. We readily picked up enough Dutch to make ourselves understood by the townspeople, the professors, and such of our 800 and odd fellow students as came into intercourse. This language, which looks so hard at first, is only a sort of polarized English. Puzzle over it a little while, and it jumps into your comprehension like one of those simple cryptograms made by running together all the words of a sentence and then dividing it in the wrong places. The language acquired and the newness of our surroundings worn off, we settled into tolerably regular pursuits. Harry devoted himself with some assiduity to the study of sociology, with a special reference to the round face and not unkind maidens of Leyden. I went in for the higher metaphysics. Outside of our respective studies, we had a common ground of unfailing interest. To our astonishment, we found that not 1 in 20 of the faculty or students knew or cared a stiver about the glorious history of the town, or even about the circumstances under which the university itself was founded by the Prince of Orange. In marked contrast with the general indifference was the enthusiasm of Professor von Stopp, my chosen guide through the cloudiness of speculative philosophy. This distinguished Hegelian was a tobacco-dry little old man with a skull cap over features which reminded me strangely of Aunt Gertrude's. Had he been her own brother, the facial resemblance could not have been closer. I told him so once when we were together in the town hall looking at the portrait of the hero of the siege, the burgomaster von der Werf. The professor laughed. "I will show you what is even a more extraordinary coincidence," said he, and leading the way across the hall to the great picture of the siege by Vannes, he pointed out the figure of a burgher participating in the defense. It was true. Von Stopp might have been the burgher's son. The burgher might have been Aunt Gertrude's father. The professor seemed to be fond of us. We often went to his rooms in an old house in Rappenbergstraat, one of the few houses remaining that antedate 1574. He would walk with us through the beautiful suburbs of the city, over straight roads lined with poplars that carried us back to the bank of the Sheepscot in our minds. He took us to the top of the ruined Roman tower in the center of the town, and from the same battlements from which anxious eyes 3 centuries ago had watched the slow approach of Admiral Boisseau's fleet over the submerged polders, he pointed out the great dike of the Landscheiding, which was cut that the oceans might bring Boisseau Zealanders to raise the siege and feed the starving. He showed us the headquarters of the Spaniard Valdez at Leiderdorp, and told us how heaven sent a violent northwest wind on the night of the 1st of October, piling up the water deep where it had been shallow, and sweeping the fleet on between Zoeterwoude and Zwieten, up to the very walls of the fort at Lammen, the last stronghold of the besiegers and the last obstacle in the way of succor to the famishing inhabitants. Then he showed us where, on the very night before the retreat of the besieging army, A huge breach was made in the wall of Leyden, near the Cow Gate, by the Walloons from Lammen. "Why," cried Harry, catching fire from the eloquence of the professor's narrative, "that was the decisive moment of the siege." The professor said nothing. He stood with his arms folded, looking intently into my cousin's eyes. "For," continued Harry, "had that point not been watched, or had the defense failed and the breach been carried by the night assault from Lammen, the town would have been burned and the people massacred under the eyes of Admiral Boisseau and the fleet of relief." "Who defended the breach?" Von Stopp replied very slowly, as if weighing every word. "History records the explosion of the mine under the city wall on the last night of the siege. It does not tell the story of the defense or give the defender's name. Yet no man that ever lived had a more tremendous charge than fate entrusted to this unknown hero. Was it chance that sent him to meet an unexpected danger? Consider some of the consequences had he failed. The fall of Leyden would have destroyed the last hope of the Prince of Orange and of the Free States. The tyranny of Philip would have been re-established. The birth of religious liberty and of self-government by the people would have been postponed who knows for how many centuries. Who knows that there would or could have been a Republic of the United States of America had there been no United Netherlands. Our university, which has given to the world Grotius, Scaliger, Arminius and Descartes, was founded upon this hero's successful defense of the breach. We owe to him our presence here today. Nay, you owe to him your very existence. Your ancestors were of Leyden. Between their lives and the butchers outside the walls, he stood that night." The little professor towered before us, a giant of enthusiasm and patriotism. Harry's eyes glistened and his cheeks reddened. "Go home, boys," said Von Stopp, "and thank God that while the burghers of Leyden were straining their gaze towards Zoeterwoude and the fleet, there was one pair of vigilant eyes and one stout heart at the town wall just beyond the Cow Gate." The rain was splashing against the windows one evening in the autumn of our third year at Leyden, when Professor Von Stopp honored us with a visit at the Bredestraat. Never had I seen the old gentleman in such spirits. He talked incessantly. The gossip of the town, the news of Europe, science, poetry, philosophy were in turn touched upon and treated with the same high and good humor. I sought to draw him out on Hegel, with whose chapter on the complexity and interdependency of things I had just then been struggling. "You do not grasp the return of itself into itself through its other self?" he said, smiling. "Well, you will sometime." Harry was silent and preoccupied. His taciturnity gradually affected even the professor. The conversation flagged, and we sat a long while without a word. Now and then there was a flash of lightning, succeeded by distant thunder. "Your clock does not go," suddenly remarked the professor. "Does it ever go?" "Never since we can remember," I replied. "That is, only once, and then it went backward. It was when Aunt Gertrude—" Here I caught a warning glance from Harry. I laughed and stammered, "Well, the clock is old and useless. It cannot be made to go." "Only backward," said the professor calmly, and not appearing to notice my embarrassment. "Well, and why should not a clock go backward? Why should not time itself turn and retrace its course?" He seemed to be waiting for an answer. I had none to give. "I thought you Hegelian enough," he continued, "to admit that every condition includes its own contradiction. Time is a condition, not an essential. Viewed from the absolute, the sequence by which future follows present and present follows past is purely arbitrary. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. There is no reason in the nature of things why the order should not be tomorrow, today, yesterday." A sharp appeal of thunder interrupted the professor's speculations. "The day is made by the planet's revolution on its axis from west to east. I fancy you can conceive conditions under which it might turn from east to west, unwinding, as it were, the revolutions of the past ages. Is it so much more difficult to imagine time unwinding itself? Time on the ebb instead of on the flow, the past unfolding as the future recedes, the centuries countermarching, the course of events proceeding toward the beginning and not as now toward the end." "But," I interposed, "we know that as far as we are concerned, the—" "We know?" exclaimed Von Stopp with growing scorn.
Your intellect has no wings. You follow in the trail of Comte and his slimy brood of creepers and crawlers. You speak with amazing assurance of your position in the universe. You seem to think that your wretched little individuality has a firm foothold in the absolute. Yet you go to bed tonight and dream into existence men, women, children, beasts of the past or the future. How do you know that at this moment you yourself, with all your conceit of 19th century thought, are anything more than a creature of a dream of the future, dreamed, let us say, by some philosopher of the 16th century? How do you know that you are anything more than a creature of a dream of the past, dreamed by some Hegelian of the 26th century? How do you know, boy, that you will not vanish into the 16th century, or 2060 the moment the dreamer awakes? There was no replying to this, for it was sound metaphysics. Harry yawned. I got up and went to the window. Professor von Staub approached the clock. "Ah, my children," said he, "there is no fixed progress of human events. Past, present, and future are woven together in one inextricable mesh. Who shall say that this old clock is not right to go backward?" A crash of thunder shook the house. The storm was over our heads. When the blinding glare had passed away, Professor von Staub was standing upon a chair before the tall timepiece. His face looked more than ever like Aunt Gertrude's. He stood as she had stood in that last quarter of an hour when we saw her wind the clock. The same thought struck Harry and myself. "Hold!" we cried as he began to wind the works. "It may be death if you—" The professor's sallow features shone with the strange enthusiasm that had transformed Aunt Gertrude's. "True," he said. "It may be death, but it may be the awakening. Past, present, future, all woven together. The shuttle goes to and fro, forward and back." He had wound the clock. The hands were whirling around the dial from right to left with inconceivable rapidity. In this world, we ourselves seem to be borne along. Eternity seemed to contract into minutes, while lifetimes were thrown off at every tick. Von Staub, both arms outstretched, was reeling in his chair. The house shook again under a tremendous peal of thunder. At the same instant, a ball of fire, leaving a wake of sulphurous vapor and filling the room with dazzling light, passed over our heads and smote the clock. Von Staub was prostrated. The hands ceased to revolve. The roar of thunder sounded like heavy cannonading. The lightning's blaze appeared as the steady light of a conflagration. With our hands over our eyes, Harry and I rushed into the night. Under a red sky, people were hurrying toward the town hall. Flames in the direction of the Roman tower told us that the heart of the town was afire. The faces of those we saw were haggard and emaciated. From every side we caught disjointed phrases of complaint or despair. "Horse flesh at 10 shillings the pound," said one, "and bread at 16 shillings. "Bread indeed," an old woman retorted. "It's 8 weeks since I have seen a crumb. My little grandchild, the lame one, went last night. Do you know what Hekabetya, the washerwoman, did? She was starving. Her babe died, and she and her man—" A louder cannon burst cut short this revelation. We made our way on toward the citadel of the town, passing a few soldiers here and there and many burghers with grim faces under their broad-brimmed felt hats. "There is bread plenty yonder where the gunpowder is, and full pardon, too. Valdez shot another amnesty over the walls this morning." An excited crowd immediately surrounded the speaker. "But the fleet," they cried. "The fleet is grounded fast on the Greenway polder. Boisseau may turn his one eye seaward for a wind till famine and pestilence have carried off every mother's son of ye, and his ark will not be a rope's length nearer. Death by plague, death by starvation, death by fire and musketry, that is what the burgomaster offers us in return for glory for himself and the kingdom for Orange." "He asks us," said a sturdy citizen, "to hold out only 24 hours longer and to pray meanwhile for an ocean wind." "Ah, yes," sneered the first speaker. "Pray on. There is bread enough locked in Peter Adriansson Vanderwerf's cellar. I warrant you that is what gives him so wonderful a stomach for resisting the most Catholic king." A young girl with braided yellow hair pressed through the crowd and confronted the malcontent. "Good people," said the maiden, "do not listen to him. He is a traitor with a Spanish heart. I am Peter's daughter. We have no bread. We ate malt cakes and rapeseed like the rest of you till it was gone. Then we stripped the green leaves from the lime trees and willows in our garden and ate them. We have eaten even the thistles and weeds that grew between the stones by the canal. The coward lies!" Nevertheless, the insinuation had its effect. The throng, now become a mob, surged off in the direction of the burgomaster's house. One ruffian raised his hand to strike the girl out of the way. In a wink, the cur was under the feet of his fellows, and Harry, panting and glowing, stood at the maiden's side, shouting defiance in good English at the backs of the rapidly retreating crowd. With the utmost frankness, she put both her arms around Harry's neck and kissed him. "Thank you," she said. "You are a hearty lad. My name is Gertrude van der Werf." Harry was fumbling in his vocabulary for the proper Dutch phrases, but the girl would not stay for compliments. "They mean mischief to my father," and she hurried us through several exceedingly narrow streets into a three-cornered marketplace dominated by a church with 2 spires. "There he is," she exclaimed, "on the steps of St. Pancras." There was a tumult in the marketplace. The conflagration raging beyond the church and the voices of the Spanish and Walloon cannon outside the walls were less angry than the roar of this multitude of desperate men clamoring for the bread that a single word from their leader's lips would bring them. "Surrender to the king," they cried, "or we will send your dead body to Lammen as Leyden's token of submission." One tall man, taller by half a head than any of the burghers confronting him, and so dark of complexion that we wondered how he could be the father of Gertrude, heard the threat in silence. When the burgomaster spoke, the mob listened in spite of themselves. "What is it you ask, my friends? That we break our vow and surrender Leyden to the Spaniards? That is to devote ourselves to a fate far more horrible than starvation. I have to keep the oath. Kill me if you will have it so. I can die only once, whether by your hands, by the enemy's, or by the hand of God. Let us starve if we must, welcoming starvation because it comes before dishonor. Your menaces do not move me. My life is at your disposal. Here, take my sword, thrust it into my breast, and divide my flesh among you to appease your hunger. So long as I remain alive, expect no surrender." There was silence again while the mob wavered. Then there were mutterings around us. Above these rang out the clear voice of the girl whose hand Harry still held, unnecessarily it seemed to me. "Do you not feel the sea wind? It has come at last. To the tower, and the first man there will see by moonlight the full white sails of the prince's ships." For several hours I scoured the streets of the town, seeking in vain my cousin and his companion. The sudden movement of the crowd toward the Roman tower had separated us. On every side I saw evidences of the terrible chastisement that had brought this stout-hearted people to the verge of despair. A man with hungry eyes chased a lean rat along the bank of the canal. A young mother with 2 dead babes in her arms sat in a doorway to which they bore the bodies of her husband and father, just killed at the walls. In the middle of a deserted street I passed unburied corpses in a pile twice as high as my head. The pestilence had been there, kinder than the Spaniard because it held out no treacherous promises while it dealt its blows. Toward morning the wind increased to a gale. There was no sleep in Leyden, no more talk of surrender, no longer any thought or care about defense. These words were on the lips of everybody I met. Daylight will bring the fleet. Did daylight bring the fleet? History says so, but I was not a witness. I know only that before dawn the gale culminated in a violent thunderstorm, and that at the same time a muffled explosion, heavier than the thunder, shook the town. I was in the crowd that watched from the Roman mound for the first signs of the approaching relief. The concussion shook hope out of every face. "Their mine has reached the wall!" "But where?" I pressed forward until I found the burgomaster, who was standing among the rest. "Quick," I whispered. "It is beyond the Cow Gate, and this side of the Tower of Burgundy." He gave me a searching glance and then strode away, without making any attempt to quiet the general panic. I followed close at his heels. It was a tight run for nearly half a mile to the rampart in question. When we reached the Cow Gate, this is what we saw. A great gap where the wall had been, opening to the swampy fields beyond. In the moat, outside and below, a confusion of upturned faces belonging to men who struggled like demons to achieve the breach, and who now gained a few feet and now were forced back. On the shattered rampart, a handful of soldiers and burghers forming a living wall where masonry had failed. Perhaps a double handful of women and girls serving stones to the defenders and boiling water in buckets, besides pitch and oil and unslaked lime, and some of them quoiting tarred and burning hoops over the necks of the Spaniards in the moat. My cousin Harry leading and directing the men, the burgomaster's daughter Gertrude encouraging and inspiring the women.
But what attracted my attention more than anything else was the frantic activity of a little figure in black who, with a huge ladle, was showering molten lead on the heads of the assailing party. As he turned to the bonfire and kettle which supplied him with ammunition, his features came into the full light. I gave a cry of surprise. The ladler of molten lead was Professor von Stopp. The Burgomaster von der Werf turned at my sudden exclamation. "Who is that?" I said. "The man at the kettle." "That," replied von der Werf, "is the brother of my wife, the clockmaker, Jan Lipperdam." The affair at the breach was over almost before we had time to grasp the situation. The Spaniards who had overthrown the wall of brick and stone found the living wall impregnable. They could not even maintain their position in the moat. They were driven off into the darkness. Now I felt a sharp pain in my left arm. Some stray missile must have hit me while we watched the fight. "Who has done this thing?" demanded the Burgomaster. "Who is it that kept watch on today while the rest of us were straining fools' eyes toward tomorrow?" Gertrude van der Werf came forward proudly, leading my cousin. "My father," said the girl. "He has saved my life." "That is much to me," said the Burgomaster, "but it is not all. He has saved Leyden and he has saved Holland." I was becoming dizzy. The faces around me seemed unreal. Why were we here with these people? Why did the thunder and lightning forever continue? Why did the clockmaker Jan Lipperdam turn always toward me the face of Professor von Stopp? "Harry," I said, "come back to our rooms." But though he grasped my hand warmly, his other hand still held that of the girl, and he did not move. Then nausea overcame me. My head swam, and the breach and its defenders faded from sight. 3 days later, I sat with one arm bandaged in my accustomed seat in von Stopp's lecture room. The place beside me was vacant. "We hear much," said the Hegelian professor, reading from a notebook in his usual dry, hurried tone, "of the influence of the 16th century upon the 19th. No philosopher, as far as I'm aware, has studied the influence of the 19th century upon the 16th. If cause produces effect, does effect never induce cause? Does the law of heredity, unlike all other laws of this universe of mind and matter, operate in one direction only? Does the descendant owe everything to the ancestor and the ancestor nothing to the descendant? Does destiny, which may seize upon our existence and for its own purposes bear us far into the future, never carry us back into the past?" I went back to my rooms in the Bredestraat, where my only companion was the silent clock. Into the Sun by Robert Duncan Milne. Scene, San Francisco. Time, 1883. "And so you think, Doctor, that the comet which has just been reported from South Africa is the same as last year's comet, the one discovered first by Krulz at Rio de Janeiro, and which was afterwards so plainly visible to us here all through the month of October? Judging from the statement in the papers regarding its general appearance and the course in which it was traveling, I do not see to what other conclusion we can come. It is approaching the sun from the same quarter as last year's comet. It resembles it in appearance. Its rate of motion is as great, if not greater. All these things are very strong arguments of identity. But then how do you account for so speedy a return? This is only the end of August, and last year's comet was computed to have passed its perihelion about the 18th of September, scarcely a year ago. Even Encke's and Biela's comets, which are denizens of our solar system, so to speak, have longer periods than that. I account for it simply on the hypothesis that this comet passes so close to the sun that its motion is retarded and its course consequently changed after every such approach. I believe, with Mr. Proctor and Professor Boss, that this is the comet of 1843 and 1880, that it is moving in a succession of eccentric spirals, the curvatures of which have reduced its periods of revolution from perhaps many hundreds of years to, at its last recorded return, 37 years, then to 2 and a fraction, and now to less than 1. And its ultimate destination is to be precipitated into the sun. This is certainly startling, supposing your hypothesis to be correct, and should such a casualty happen, what result would you anticipate? That demands some consideration. Take another cigar, and we shall look into the matter. The foregoing conversation took place in the rooms of my friend Dr. Arkwright upon Market Street. The time was about 11 o'clock at night. The date, the 27th of August. The interrogations were mine, and the answers the doctor's. I may add that the doctor was a chemist of no mean attainments, and took great interest in all scientific discussions and experiments. "The effect of the collision of a comet with the sun," observed the doctor as he lit his cigar, "would depend upon a good many conditions.
It would depend primarily upon the mass, momentum, and velocity of the comet. Something, too, upon its constitution. Let me see that paragraph again. Here it is. And the doctor proceeded to read from the paper. Rio de Janeiro, August 18. The comet was again visible last evening, before and after sunset, about 30 degrees from the sun. Mr. Krolz pronounces it identical with the comet of last year. It is approaching the sun at the rate of 2.5 degrees a day. Now this, he went on, corresponds exactly with the position and motion of last year's comet. It came from a point nearly due south of the sun, consequently was invisible to the northern hemisphere before perihelion. Pardon me, I interrupted, but you remember the newspaper predictions regarding last year's comet were to the effect that it would speedily become invisible to us here, whereas it continued to adorn the morning skies for weeks, till it faded away in the remote distance. That was because the nature of its orbit was not distinctly understood. The plane of the comet's orbit cut the plane of the Earth's orbit nearly at right angles, but the major axis or general direction of its orbit in space was also inclined some 50 degrees to our plane, and so it came about that while the approach of the comet was from a point somewhat east of south, its return journey into space was along a line some 20 degrees south of west, which threw its course nearly along the line of the celestial equator. Consequently, last year's comet was visible in the early morning not only to us, but to every inhabitant of the Earth between the 60th parallel north and the South Pole, until the vast distance caused it to disappear. But, as I was going to say when you interrupted me, if the distance of the comet from the sun was only 30 degrees when observed at Rio de Janeiro 9 days ago, and its speed was then 2.5 degrees a day, it cannot be far from perihelion now, especially as its speed increases as it approaches the sun. Suppose it should strike the sun this time, said I. What results would you predict? A solid globe, replied the doctor, of the size of our Earth, if falling upon the sun with the momentum resulting from direct attraction from its present position in space, would engender sufficient heat to maintain the solar fires at their existing standard without further supply for about 90 years. This calculation does not involve great scientific or mathematical knowledge, but on the contrary, is as simple as it is reliable, because we have positive data to go upon in the mass and momentum of our planet. But with a comet, the case is different. We do not know what elements its nucleus is composed of. It is true we know the value of its momentum, but what does that tell us if we do not know its density or its mass? A momentum of 400 miles a second, the estimated rate of speed of the present comet at perihelion, would undoubtedly engender fierce combustion were a comet a ponderable body. On the other hand, large bodies composed of fluid matter, highly volatilized, might collide with the sun without an appreciable effect. Have we any data to go upon in this matter? I inquired. With regard to our own sun, replied the doctor, we have not. But several suggestive circumstances have occurred in the case of other suns which lead us to infer that something similar might happen to our own. Some years ago, a star in the constellation Cygnus was observed to suddenly blaze out with extraordinary brilliancy, its luster increasing from that of a star of the 6th magnitude, but faintly distinguishable to the unaided eye, to that of a star of the 1st. This brilliancy was maintained for several days, when it resumed its original condition. Now, it is fair to infer that this great increase of light may have been caused by the precipitation of some large solid body, a planet, a comet, or perhaps another sun, upon the sun in question. And as light and heat are now understood to be merely different modes or expressions of the same quality of motion, it is fair to infer further that the increment of heat corresponded to that of light. What then do you suppose would be the natural effect upon ourselves here on this planet by some such catastrophe happening to our own sun? I asked. The light and heat of our luminary might be increased 100-fold or 1,000-fold according to the nature of the collision. One can conceive of combustion so fierce as to evaporate all our oceans in one short minute, or even to volatilize the solid matter of our planet in less than that time, like a globule of mercury in a hot air chamber. Large and small are not absolute but relative terms in nature's vocabulary. Both are equally amenable to her laws, sententiously observed the doctor. A comforting reflection, certainly, I remarked. Let us hope we shall not be favored with any such experience. Who can tell? Rejoined the doctor as he rose from his seat. Excuse me for a minute. You know there is a balloon ascension from Woodward Gardens tomorrow, and there is a new ingredient I'm going to introduce at the inflation. The stuff wants a little more mixing. Take another cigar. I won't be a minute. I sat back and meditated as I listened to the retreating footsteps of the doctor as he passed into an adjoining room. I looked at the clock. It was 11:30. It was a warm night for San Francisco in August, remarkably so, in fact.
I got up to open the window, and as I did so, the doctor entered the room again. "What is that?" I exclaimed involuntarily as I threw up the sash, and the spectacle which met my eyes as I did so certainly warranted the exclamation. Dr. Arkwright's rooms were on the north side of Market Street, and the inferior height of the buildings opposite afforded an uninterrupted view of the horizon to the south and east. Over the tops of the houses to the east could be seen a thin, vivid line marking the waters of the bay, and beyond it the serrated outline of the Alameda Hills. All this was normal, and just as I had seen it 100 times before. But in the northeast, the sky was lit up with a lurid, dull red glow, which extended northward along the horizon in a broadening arc, till the view was shut out by the street line to our left. This light resembled in all respects the aurora borealis, except that of colour. Instead of the cold, clear radiance of the northern light, we were confronted by an angry, blood-red glare which ever and anon shot forks and tongues and streamers of fire upward towards the zenith. It was as if some vast conflagration were in progress to our north. But what, I asked myself, could produce so extensive, so powerful an illumination? Vast forest fires or the burning of large cities make themselves manifest by a sky-reflected glare for great distances, but they do not display the regularity or the harmony, so to speak, which was apparent in the present instance. The conclusion was inevitable, that the phenomenon was not local in its source. As we looked out of the window, we could see that the scene had arrested the attention of others besides ourselves. Little knots of people had collected on the sidewalk, larger knots at the street corners, and the passers-by kept turning their heads to gaze at the strange spectacle. At the same time, the air was growing heavier and more sultry every minute. There was not a breath stirring, but an ominous and preternatural calm seemed to brood over the city, like that which in some climates is the precursor of a storm, and which here is frequently known as earthquake weather. The doctor broke the silence. "This is something quite out of the common run of events," he exclaimed. "That light in the north must have a cause. All the Sonoma and Mendocino redwoods, with all the pineries of Oregon and Washington territory thrown in, would not make such a blaze as that. Besides, that is not the sort of sky reflection a forest fire would cause." "Just my own idea," I asserted. "Let us see if we cannot connect it with a wider origin. It is now nearly midnight. The light is in the north. The sun's rays are now illuminating the other side of the globe. It is therefore sunrise on the Atlantic, noon in Eastern Europe, and sunset in Western Asia. When you came here scarcely an hour ago, the heavens were clear and the temperature normal. Whatever has given rise to this extraordinary phenomenon has done so within the last hour. Even since we began to look, I see that the extremity of the illuminated arc has shifted further to the east. The light has its origin in the sun, but it altogether passes the bounds of experience." "Might we not connect it with the comet we have just been speaking about?" I suggested. "It should be now near its perihelion point." "That must be it," acquiesced the doctor. "Who knows but that the fiery wanderer has actually come in contact with the sun? Let us go out." We put on our hats and left the building. All along the sidewalks we came upon excited groups staring at the strange light and speculating upon its cause. The general expression of opinion referred it to some vast forest fire, though there were not wanting religious enthusiasts who saw in it a manifestation of all things, for in the uninformed human mind there is no middle ground between the grossly practical and the purely fanatical. We hurried along Market Street and turned down Kearney, where the crowds were even denser and more anxious-looking. Arrived at the Chronicle office, I noticed that a succession of messengers from the various telegraph offices were encountering each other on the stairs of the building. "If you will wait a minute," I said to the doctor, "I will run upstairs and find out what is the matter." "Strange news from the east," said the telegraphic editor, hurriedly in answer to my question, at the same time pointing to a little pile of dispatches. "These have been coming in for the last half hour from all points of the Union." I took up one and read the contents. "New York, 3:15 a.m. Extraordinary light just broke out over the eastern horizon, very red and threatening. Seems to proceed from a great distance out at sea. People unable to assign cause." Another ran as follows: "New Orleans, 4:10 a.m. Vivid conflagration reflected in the sky, a little north of east. General sentiment that vast fires have sprung up in the cane brakes. Population abroad and anxious." "There are a score more," remarked the editor, "from Chicago, Memphis, Canada, everywhere in fact, all to the same purpose. What do you make of it?" "The phenomenon is evidently universal," I said. "It must have its origin in the sun. Do you notice how hot and stifling the air is getting? Have you any dispatches from Europe?" "None yet." "Ah, here is a cablegram repeated from New York," said the editor, taking a dispatch from the hand of a messenger who just then entered. "This may tell us something. Listen. London, 7:45 a.m.
5 minutes ago, sun's heat became overpowering. Business stopped. People falling dead in streets. Thermometer risen from 52 degrees to 113, still rising. Message from Greenwich Observatory says...
The dispatch stops abruptly there, interpolated the editor. And the New York operator goes on thus. Message cut short. Nothing more through cable. Intense alarm everywhere. Light and heat increasing. Well, said I, it must be as Dr. Arkwright suggested. The comet observed again at Rio de Janeiro 10 days ago has fallen into the sun. Heaven only knows what we'd better do. I shall edit these dispatches and get the paper out at any rate, said the editor with determination. Ah, here comes the ice for the printers, as half a dozen men filed past the door, each with a sack upon his shoulder. The paper must come out if the earth burns for it. I fancy we can hold out until sunrise, and before then the worst may be over. I left the office, rejoined the doctor in the street, and told him the news. There can be no doubt about it, he remarked at once. The comet of last year has fallen into the sun. All the telegraphic messages were nearly identical in time, as it is now just midnight here and consequently about 4 o'clock in New York and 8 o'clock in England. What do we better do? Queried I. I do not think there is any cause for immediate alarm, replied the doctor. We shall see whether the heat increases materially between now and sunrise and take measures accordingly. Meanwhile, let us look about us. The scenes of alarm were intensified in the streets as we passed along. It seemed as if half the population of the city had left their houses and gathered in the most public places. Thousands of people were pushing and jostling each other in the neighborhood of the various newspaper offices in frantic endeavors to get a glimpse of the bulletin boards, where the substance of various telegrams were posted up as fast as they came in. Multitudes of hacks and express wagons were driving hither and thither, crowded with family parties seemingly intent upon leaving the city, and probably without any definite aim or accurate comprehension of what they were doing or whither they were going. As the hours wore on toward morning, the angry red arch moved farther along the horizon. Its outlines grew bolder and brighter, and its flaming crest towered higher in the heavens. Nothing could be conceived more ominous or ghastly, more calculated to produce feelings of brutish terror, and to convince the spectator of his utter powerlessness to cope with an inevitable and inexorable event, than this blood-red arch of flame which spread over 1/4 of the apparent horizon. The air, too, was momentarily growing heavier and more stifling. A glance at a thermometer in one of the hotels gave a temperature of 114 degrees. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, 4 successive alarms of fire were sounded from the lower quarters of the city. 2 large wholesale houses and a liquor store in 3 contiguous blocks caught fire, evidently the work of incendiaries. Multitudes of the worst rabble collected, as if by concert, in the business quarters. Shops and warehouses were broken into and looted. The police force, though working vigorously, not being strong enough to arrest the work of pillage, backed as it was by the moral terrors of the night and the general paralysis which unnerved the better class of citizens. Strange scenes were being enacted at every corner and on every street. Groups of women kneeling upon sidewalks and rending the air with prayers and lamentations were jostled aside by ruffians wild and furious with liquor. A procession of religious fanatics, chanting shrill and discordant hymns and bearing lanterns in their hands, passed unheeded through the crowded streets, and we could afterward watch them threading their way up the steep side of Telegraph Hill. In short, the terrible and bizarre effects of that fearful night would overtax the pen of a Dante to describe or the pencil of a Dore to portray. Let us go home, said the doctor, looking at his watch. It is now 3:30. The temperature of the atmosphere is evidently rising. The chances are that it will become unbearable after sunrise. We must consider what is best to do. We pushed our way back through the crowded streets, past despairing and terror-stricken men and wailing women. But as we passed the bulletin boards at the corner of Bush and Kearney Streets, it was encouraging to mark that at least one earthly industry would continue to go on till the mechanism could run no longer, and that the world would at any rate get full particulars of its approaching doom, so long as wires could transmit them, compositors set them in type, and the pressmen print them. I felt that the power and grandeur of the press had never been more fully exemplified than in the regular and ceaseless pulsations of its machinery as the daily issue was being thrown off with the news that the other hemisphere was in conflagration, and that a few short hours would in all probability witness the same catastrophe in our own. The last 2 wagons which had driven up with ice for the employees had been boarded and sacked by the thirsty mob, and looking down into the press room as I entered the building, I could see the pressmen stripped to the waist in the terrible hot air bath, while upstairs the telegraphic editor was in similar déshabille, with the additional feature of a wet towel bound round his temples. He motioned to the last dispatch from New York as I entered. I took it up and read as follows. New York, 6 a.m., sun just risen, heat terrible,
air suffocating, people seeking shade, thousands bathing off the docks, thousands killed by sunstroke. Almost a recapitulation of the London message of 3 hours ago, I said as I hurried out. 3 hours hence, we may expect the same here. I rejoined the doctor in the street, and together we proceeded to his apartments. Now, said he, as I told him the purport of the last message, there is only one thing to be done if we wish to save our lives. It is a chance if even this plan will succeed. But at all events, there is a chance. What is it? I asked eagerly. I take it, answered he, that the increase of light and heat which will accrue as soon as the sun rises above the horizon must prove fatal to all animal life beneath the influence of its beams. The population of Europe, and by this time I doubt not of all this country east of the Mississippi, is next to annihilated. With us it is but a question of time, unless... Unless what? I exclaimed excitedly, as he paused thoughtfully. Unless we're willing to run a great risk, he added. You are a philosopher enough to know that heat and light are simply modes of motion, expressions, so to speak, of the same molecular action of the elements they pass through or agitate. They have no intrinsic being in themselves, no entity, no existence, as it were, independent of outside matter. In their case, the two forms of outside matter affected by them are the ether pervading space and the atmosphere of our planet. Do you follow? Certainly, I replied impatiently, for I dreaded one of the doctor's disquisitions at such a critical moment as this. But my dear sir, what is the practical application of your theorem? How can we apply it to the case in point? In this wise, he went on, heat, that is, the heat we have to do with now, is caused by the action of the sun's rays upon our atmosphere. If we get beyond the limits of that atmosphere, what then? Simply, we have no heat. Ascend to a sufficient altitude, even under the cloudless rays of the vertical sun, and you will freeze to death. The limit of perpetual snow is not an extreme one. I catch your idea perfectly, I assented. I can see the accuracy of your premises. But what does it avail us? The Sierra Nevada mountains are practically as far off as the peaks of the Himalayas. There are other means, rejoined the doctor, of attaining the necessary altitude. A balloon ascension, as you are aware, was to have taken place today at Woodward's Gardens. I was going to assist at the inflation, to test a new method of generating gas. I now propose that we endeavor to gain possession of the balloon and make the ascension. I do not think we shall be anticipated or thwarted in doing so. We must remember that the risk of the balloon bursting through the expansion of the gas is great, for we shall be exposed not only to its normal expansion should we penetrate the upper atmospheric strata, but its abnormal expansion through heat should we fail to do so in time. It is shaking the dice with death in any case, I answered, and proceeded to assist the doctor in packing the apparatus and chemicals he had prepared overnight. And having done so, we left the building and hastened southward along Market Street. The cars were not running, and the carriages we saw paid no heed to our importunities, so the precious time seemed to fly past while we swiftly covered the mile which separated us from the gardens. The gates were luckily open, and none of the employees visible, so we made for the spot where the balloon, half inflated, lay like some slimy antediluvian monster in its lair. We adjusted the apparatus and arranged the ropes as speedily as possible, and waited anxiously while the great bag slowly swelled and shook, rearing itself and falling back by turns, but gradually assuming more and more spherical proportions. Meanwhile, we had again opportunity to observe the condition of the atmosphere in the heavens. It was already 4:30, and in less than an hour the sun would spring up in the east. The pale, bluish tints of daybreak were beginning to assert themselves beside the lurid semicircle which flamed above them. This latter changed to a hard, coppery hue as daylight became stronger, but preserved its contour unchanged. The heat became more oppressive, the thermometer, which we had brought with us, now registering 133 degrees. Strange sounds were wafted in from the city, meaningless indeed, but rendered fearfully suggestive by the circumstances of the morning. The animals howled unceasingly from their cages, and we could hear their frantic struggles for liberty. One cat-like form which had made good its escape shot past us in the gloom. Had the whole menagerie been set free at that moment, we should have had nothing to fear from them, so great is the influence elemental crises exert over the brute creation. We had at last the satisfaction of seeing the great globe swing clear of the ground, though not yet fully inflated, and tug at the ropes which moored it. We had already placed the ballast bags and other necessary articles in the car when, perspiring at every pore, we simultaneously cut the last ropes and rose heavily into the air. There was not a breath of wind stirring, but our course was guided slightly east in the direction of the bay. It was now broad daylight, and the upper limb of the sun appeared above the horizon as we estimated our altitude from surrounding objects at about 1,000 feet.
As the full orb appeared, the heat became more intense, and by the doctor's direction we swathed our heads in flannel sprinkled sparingly with a preparation of ether and alcohol, the swift evaporation of which imparted coolness for a short time. The sky had now assumed the appearance of a vast brazen dome, and the waters of the ocean to the west and the bay beneath us reflected the dull, dead, pitiless glare with horrible fidelity. We had taken the precaution to hang heavy blankets upon the ropes sustaining the car, and these we kept sparingly moistened with water. Our own thirst was as intense as our perspiration was profuse, and we had divested ourselves of everything but our woolen underclothing, wool being a non-conductor and therefore as effective in excluding heat as retaining it. We were provided with a powerful ship telescope and also a large binocular glass of long range, and so far as the discomforts of the situation would permit us, we took observations of the prospect beneath. To the unaided eye, the city simply presented a patch of little rectangles at the end of a brown peninsula, but through our glasses, the streets and houses became surprisingly plain. Little squat black forms were seen to be moving, falling down and lying in the streets. Down by the city front, the wharves were seen to be lined with nude or semi-nude bodies which dived into the water and remained submerged with the exception of their heads, though these disappeared at short intervals below the surface. Thousands upon thousands of people were thus engaged. The spectacle would have been utterly absurd and ludicrous had it not been tremendous in its awful suggestiveness. "The mortality will be terrible, I fear," said the doctor, "if things do not change for the better soon, and I see no prospect of that. Our thermometer already marks 147 degrees even at this altitude. We are in the tepidarium of a thrice-heated Turkish bath, and if this is the case at a barometric altitude of 11,000 feet, nearly 2 perpendicular miles, what must it be down there? It is too terrible to contemplate." "It is only 7 o'clock yet," I remarked, looking at my watch. "The sun is scarcely an hour high." "We must throw out more ballast," said the doctor, "and reach the higher strata at all hazards." He threw out a 40-pound bag of sand. We shot upward with tremendous velocity for several minutes when our ascent again became regular. We now remarked with intense relief that the thermometer did not rise, that in fact it had fallen about 2 degrees, though this relief was counterbalanced by the extreme difficulty of breathing the rarefied air at this immense altitude, which we estimated by the barometer at 25,000 feet, or nearly 5 perpendicular miles. We therefore opened the valve and discharged a quantity of gas, and presently descended into a stratum of dense fog. This fog reminded me of the steam which rises from tropical vegetation during the rainy season, and I mentioned the fact to the doctor. "If these fogs," replied he, "would only rest upon the city, they might shield it from destruction. But in a case of this kind, we have no meteorological data to go on. No one can estimate either the amount of heat or the meteorological results it is now producing on the surface of the earth 5 miles below us." The stratum of fog in which we now were was dense and impenetrable. We lay in it as in a steam bath, the balloon not seeming to drift, but swaying sluggishly from side to side, like a sail flapping idly against a mast in a calm. Hour after hour passed like this, the temperature still ranging from 130 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The doctor preserved his wonted equanimity. "I have grave apprehensions," he remarked impressively, as if in answer to my thoughts, "that the final fiery cataclysm, a foreboding of which has run through all systems of philosophies and religions through all ages, and which seems to be, as it were, ingrained in the inner consciousness of man, is now upon us. I am determined, however, not to fall a victim to the fiery energy that has been evoked, and shall anticipate such a fate by an easier and less disagreeable one." And as he spoke, he motioned significantly toward his right hip. "Do you think, then," said I, "that an act under such circumstances, designedly employing a vague periphrasis on such an unpleasant topic, is morally defensible?" "What can it matter?" returned the doctor with a shrug. "Of 2 alternatives, both leading to the same end, common sense accepts the easier. A refusal to touch the hemlock would not have saved Socrates." In spite of the terrible forebodings which filled me, the exigencies of the situation seemed to render my brain preternaturally concentrated and abnormally active. The surrounding stillness, the lack of sound of any description, the dreamy warmth of the dense mist in which we lay, exercised a sedative influence, and rendered the mind peculiarly impressionable to action from within. "We have no means, then, of calculating the probable intensity of the heat at the Earth's surface?" I asked. "None whatever," replied the doctor. "We are now at an indicated elevation, by barometrical pressure, of 22,000 feet. We're probably actually much higher, as the steam in which we lie is acting on the barometer. Atmospheric conditions like the present at such an altitude are totally beyond the experience of science. They might be, and probably are, caused by the action of intense heat upon hotter surfaces below us. To the fact of their presence, however, we owe our existence. This atmosphere, though peculiarly favorable to the passage of heat rays through it, is incapable of retaining them. Supposing, I went on in a wildly speculative mood engendered by the excitement of the occasion, supposing that the heat of the surface of the Earth was sufficiently intense to melt metals, iron for instance, the most refractory of substances in fact. Take a further flight. Supposing that such heat were 10 times intensified, what would be its effect upon our planet? The solid portions, the crust with everything upon it, would be the first to experience the effects of such a catastrophe. Then the oceans would boil, and their surface waters at any rate be converted into steam. What then? I continued. This steam would ascend to the upper regions of the atmosphere till it reached an equilibrium of rarefaction, when its expansion would cool it, upon which rapid condensation would follow, and it would descend to Earth in the form of rain. The more sudden and energetic the heat, the sooner would this result be accomplished, and the more copious the precipitation of the succeeding rain. After the first terrible crisis, the grand compensation of natural law would come into play, and the face of the planet would be protected from further harm by the shield of humid vapor. Equilibrium would be restored, but most organisms would meanwhile have perished. Most organisms, you say? I repeated inquiringly. It is possible, said the doctor, that ocean infusoria and even some of the comparatively higher forms of ocean life might survive. It is also possible that terrestrial animals occupying high altitudes, mountaineers for example, whose homes are deep snows and glaciers, denizens of the frozen zone and beings similarly situated, might escape. This would altogether depend upon the intensity and duration of the heat. We must remember that size, looked at from a universal point of view, is merely relative. If we consider our planet as a 6-inch ball, our oceans, with their insignificant average depth of a few miles, would be aptly represented by a film of the finest writing paper. How long, think you, would a watery film such as that last a few feet from a suddenly stirred fire? I bowed acquiescence to the conclusion drawn from the simile, and the doctor proceeded. There can be no longer any doubt that the present elemental convulsion is due to the collision of the comet with the sun. Knowing what we do of its orbit from last year's computation, its precipitation upon the solar surface has taken place on the side farthest from our own position in space. We do not, therefore, experience so sudden and so fierce atmospherical excitement as would otherwise have followed. It now remains to be seen what the duration of the effect will be. During the latter portion of our conversation, a low moaning sound, which had been heard for the past few minutes, was growing more pronounced and seemingly coming nearer. At the same time, the barometer was observed to be falling rapidly. "That is the sound of wind," I exclaimed. "I have heard it on tropical deserts and on tropical seas. I cannot be mistaken. It comes from the east." "The hot air from the parched continent is approaching," said the doctor. "Scientifically speaking, atmospheric convection is taking place, and we shall bear the brunt of it." As he spoke, the balloon was seized with a violent tremor. It vibrated from apex to car, and the next moment was struck by the most terrific tornado it is possible to imagine. The blast was like the torrid breath of a furnace, and we involuntarily covered our heads with our blankets and clutched convulsively at the frail bulwarks of the car, which was being dragged on at a tremendous velocity and at a horribly acute angle by the distended gas bag which towered ahead of us. Luckily, we had both clutched mechanically at the railing on the side whence the wind came. To let go would have meant instant precipitation over the opposite side of the car into the yawning gulf beneath. For less than a minute, so far as my stricken and scattered senses could compute, we were borne on by this terrific simoom, when suddenly we found ourselves, as before, in the midst of a preternatural calm. We had evidently drifted into an eddy of the cyclone, for I could hear its sullen and awful roar at some distance to our right. Hardly had we composed ourselves when the blast struck us again, this time on the opposite side of the car. Again we were hurled forward by the resistless elemental fury, but this time in a sensibly downward direction. The blast had struck us from above and was hurling us before it down, down to inevitable destruction. Fortunately, the comparative bulk of the balloon offered more resistance than the car to this downward progress. Down, down we sped, till of a sudden we emerged from the cloud strata and obtained a brief and abrupt glimpse of the scene below. The counterblasts of the past few minutes had apparently compensated each other's action, for we found ourselves just over the city. The city? There was no city. I recognized indeed the contour of the peninsula and the well-known outlines of the bay and islands, through casual rifts in the dense clouds of steam which rose in volumes from below. Well-nigh stupefied and maddened as I was by the intense heat, a horrible curiosity seized me to peer into the dread mystery beneath. And while with one scorched and writhing hand I held the blankets, which had not yet parted with the moisture gathered from the clouds above, to my aching head and temples, with the other I raised the powerful binocular to my eyes. I caught glimpses which filled me with unutterable and nameless horror. Neither streets nor buildings were decipherable where the city once had been. The eye rested upon nothing but irregular and misshapen piles of vitrified slag and calcined ashes. Everything was as scarred in a ruinous silence as the ruined surface of the moon. There was neither flame nor fire to be seen. Things seemed to have long passed the stage of active combustion, as though all the elements necessary to sustain flame had already been abstracted from them. Here and there, an ominous dark red glow showed, however, that the lava into which the fair city had been transformed was still incandescent. The sand dunes to the west shone like glaciers or dull mirrors through the steam fissures, and long, shapeless masses of what resembled charred wood were strewn here and there over the surface of the bay. Less than 5 seconds served to reveal all that I have taken so long to describe. The binocular, too hot to hold, dropped from my hand. At the same moment, the balloon was again struck by the cyclone and dashed eastward with the same fury as before. The doctor caught convulsively at the railing of the car, missed his hold, and with a wild, despairing shriek, outstretched arms and starting eyes fixed upon mine, disappeared headlong in the abyss. I am alone in the balloon, perhaps alone in the world. My companion has been hurled to a fiery death below. His awful shriek still rings in my ears. It sounds over the sullen roar of the cyclone. I am whirled resistlessly onward. The blast shifts. Again the balloon pauses in one of the strange eddies formed by this strange simoom. The wind dies away to a moan. It rises again. It writhes around the car like the convulsive struggles of some gigantic reptile in the throes of death. It seizes me again in its resistless clutch. The balloon is being whirled towards the earth. I am falling. But no, it seemed to me that the earth, the plutonic igneous earth, is rising toward me. With lightning-like rapidity, it seems to hurl itself up through the air to meet me. I hear the roar of flames mingling with the roar of the blast. I see the seething, bubbling waste of waters through the rifts in the clouds of steam. I am nearing the molten surface. My feeling has changed. I am conscious that it has ceased to seem to rise. I feel that I am falling now, falling into the fiery depths below. Nearer, nearer yet. Scorched and blackened by the awful heat as I approach. I fall down, down, down. A Tale of Negative Gravity by Frank R. Stockton. My wife and I were staying at a small town in northern Italy, and on a certain pleasant afternoon in spring, we had taken a walk of 6 or 7 miles to see the sunset behind some low mountains to the west of the town. Most of our walk had been along a hard, smooth highway, and then we turned into a series of narrower roads, sometimes bordered by walls and sometimes by light fences of reed or cane. Nearing the mountain, to a low spur of which we intended to ascend, we easily scaled a wall about 4 feet high and found ourselves upon pasture land, which led, sometimes by gradual ascents and sometimes by bits of rough climbing, to the spot we wished to reach. We were afraid we were a little late, and therefore hurried on, running up the grassy hills and bounding briskly over the rough and rocky places. I carried a knapsack strapped firmly to my shoulders, and under my wife's arm was a large, soft basket of a kind much used by tourists. Her arm was passed through the handles and around the bottom of the basket, which she pressed closely to her side. This was the way she always carried it. The basket contained 2 bottles of wine, one sweet for my wife and another a little acid for myself. Sweet wines give me a headache. When we reached the grassy bluff, well known thereabouts to lovers of sunset views, I stepped immediately to the edge to gaze upon the scene. But my wife sat down to take a sip of wine, for she was very thirsty, and then, leaving her basket, she came to my side. The scene was indeed one of great beauty. Beneath it stretched a wide valley of many shades of green, with a little river running through it, and red-tiled houses here and there. Beyond rose a range of mountains, pink, pale green, and purple, where their tips caught the reflection of the setting sun. and of a rich grey-green in shadows. Beyond all was the blue Italian sky, illumined by an especially fine sunset. My wife and I are Americans, and at the time of the story were middle-aged people and very fond of seeing, in each other's company, whatever there was of interest or beauty around us. We had a son about 22 years old, of whom we were also very fond, but he was not with us, being at that time a student in Germany. Although we had good health, we were not very robust people, and under ordinary circumstances not much given to long country tramps. I was of medium size, without much muscular development, while my wife was quite stout and growing stouter. The listener may perhaps be somewhat surprised that a middle-aged couple, not very strong or very good walkers, the lady loaded with a basket containing 2 bottles of wine and a metal drinking cup, and the gentleman carrying a heavy knapsack filled with all sorts of odds and ends strapped to his shoulders, should set off on a 7-mile walk, jump over a wall, run up a hillside, and yet feel in very good trim to enjoy a sunset view. This peculiar state of things I will proceed to explain. I had been a professional man, but some years before had retired upon a very comfortable income. I had always been very fond of scientific pursuits, and now made these the occupation and pleasure of much of my leisure time. Our home was in a small town, and in a corner of my grounds I built a laboratory, where I carried on my work and my experiments. I had long been anxious to discover the means not only of producing, but of retaining and controlling a natural force, really the same as centrifugal force, but which I called negative gravity. This name I adopted because it indicated better than any other the action of the force in question as I produced it. Positive gravity attracts everything toward the center of the Earth. Negative gravity, therefore, would be that power which repels everything from the center of the Earth, just as the negative pole of a magnet repels the needle, while the positive pole attracts it. My object was, in fact, to store centrifugal force and to render it constant, controllable, and available for use. The advantages of such a discovery could scarcely be described. In a word, it would lighten the burdens of the world. I will not touch upon the labors and disappointments of several years. It is enough to say that at last I discovered a method of producing, storing, and controlling negative gravity. The mechanism of my invention was rather complicated, but the method of operating it was very simple. A strong metallic case, about 8 inches long and half as wide, contained the machinery for producing the force, and this was put into action by means of the pressure of a screw worked from the outside. As soon as this pressure was produced, negative gravity began to be evolved and stored, and the greater the pressure, the greater the force. As the screw was moved outward and the pressure diminished, the force decreased, and when the screw was withdrawn to its fullest extent, the action of negative gravity entirely ceased. Thus this force could be produced or dissipated at will to such degrees as might be desired, and its action, so long as the requisite pressure was maintained, was constant. When this little apparatus worked to my satisfaction, I called my wife into my laboratory and explained to her my invention and its value. She had known that I had been at work with an important object, but I'd never told her what it was. I had said that if I succeeded, I would tell her all, but if I failed, she need not be troubled with the matter at all. Being a very sensible woman, this satisfied her perfectly. Now I explained everything to her, the construction of the machine and the wonderful uses to which this invention could be applied. I told her that it could diminish or entirely dissipate the weight of objects of any kind. A heavily loaded wagon, with 2 of these instruments fastened to its sides and each screwed to a proper force, would be so lifted and supported that it would press upon the ground as lightly as an empty cart, and a small horse could draw it with ease. A bale of cotton with one of these attached could be handled and carried by a boy. A car with a number of these machines could be made to rise in the air like a balloon. Everything, in fact, that was heavy could be made light, and, as great part of labor all over the world is caused by the attraction of gravitation, so this repellent force, wherever applied, would make weight less and work easier. I told her of many, many ways in which the invention might be used, and would have told her more if she had not suddenly burst into tears. "The world has gained something wonderful," she exclaimed between her sobs, "but I have lost a husband." "What do you mean by that?" I asked in surprise. "I haven't minded so far," she said, "because it gave you something to do, and it pleased you, and it never interfered with our home pleasures and our home life. But now that is all over. You will never be your own master again. It will succeed, I'm sure, and you will make a great deal of money, but we don't need money. What we need is the happiness which we have always had until now.
Now there will be companies and patents and lawsuits and experiments and people calling you a humbug and other people saying they discovered it long ago and all sorts of persons coming to see you, and you'll be obliged to go to all sorts of places and you will be an altered man and we shall never be happy again. Millions of money will not repay us for the happiness we have lost."
These words of my wife struck me with much force. Before I had called her, my mind had begun to be filled and perplexed with ideas of what I ought to do now that the great invention was perfected. Until now, the matter had not troubled me at all. Sometimes I had gone backward, sometimes forward, but on the whole, I had always felt encouraged. I had taken great pleasure in the work, but I never allowed myself to be too much absorbed by it. But now everything was different. I began to feel that it was due to myself and to my fellow beings that I should properly put this invention before the world. And how should I set about it? What steps should I take? I must make no mistakes. When the matter should become known, hundreds of scientific people might set themselves to work. How could I tell but that they might discover other methods of producing the same effect? I must guard myself against a great many things. I must get patents in all parts of the world. Already, as I have said, my mind began to be troubled and perplexed with these things. I could not but agree with my wife that the joys of a quiet and contented life were now about to be broken into. "My dear," said I believe with you that the thing will do us more harm than good. If it were not for depriving the world of the invention, I would throw the whole thing to the winds. And yet," I added regretfully, "I had expected a great deal of personal gratification from the use of this invention." "Now listen," said my wife eagerly. "Don't you think it would be best to do this? Use the thing as much as you please for our own amusement and satisfaction, but let the world wait. It has waited a long time, and let it wait a little longer. When we are dead, let Herbert have the invention. He will then be old enough to judge for himself whether it will be better to take advantage of it for his own profit, or simply to give it to the public for nothing. It would be cheating him if we were to do the latter. But it would also be doing him a great wrong if we were, at his age, to load him with such a heavy responsibility. Besides, if he took it up, you could not help going into it too." I took my wife's advice. I wrote a careful and complete account of the invention, and sealing it up, I gave it to my lawyers to be handed to my son after my death. If he died first, I would make other arrangements. Then I determined to get all the good and fun out of the thing that was possible without telling anyone anything about it. Even Herbert, who was away from home, was not to be told of the invention. The first thing I did was to buy a strong leather knapsack, and inside of this I fastened my little machine, with the screws so arranged that it could be worked from the outside. Strapping this firmly to my shoulders, my wife gently turned the screw at the back until the upward tendency of the knapsack began to lift and sustain me. When I felt myself so gently supported and upheld that I seemed to weigh about 30 or 40 pounds, I would set out for a walk. The knapsack did not raise me from the ground, but it gave me a very buoyant step. It was no labor at all to walk. It was delight, an ecstasy. With the strength of a man and the weight of a child, I gaily strode along. The first day I walked 6 miles at a very brisk pace and came back without feeling in the least degree tired. These walks now became one of the greatest joys of my life. When nobody was looking, I would bound over a fence, sometimes just touching it with one hand, and sometimes not touching it at all. I delighted in rough places. I sprang over streams, I jumped and I ran. I felt like Mercury himself. I now set about making another machine so that my wife could accompany me in my walks. But when it was finished, she positively refused to use it. "I can't wear a knapsack," she said, "and there is no other good way of fastening it to me. Besides, everybody about here knows I am no walker, and it would only set them talking." I occasionally made use of this second machine, but I will give only one instance of its application. Some repairs were needed to the foundation walls of my barn, and a 2-horse wagon, loaded with building stone, had been brought into my yard and left there. In the evening, when the men had gone away, I took my 2 machines and fastened them with strong chains, one on each side of the loaded wagon. Then, gradually turning the screws, the wagon was so lifted that its weight became very greatly diminished. We had an old donkey which used to belong to Herbert, and which was now occasionally used with a small cart to bring packages from the station. I went into the barn and put the harness on the little fellow, and bringing him out to the wagon, I attached him to it. In this position he looked very funny, with a long pole sticking out in front of him and the great wagon behind him. When all was ready, I touched him up, and to my great delight, he moved off with a 2-horse load of stone as easily as if he were drawing his own cart. I led him out into the public road, along which he proceeded without difficulty. He was an opinionated little beast, and sometimes stopped, not liking the peculiar manner in which he was harnessed, but a touch of the switch made him move on, and I soon turned him and brought the wagon back into the yard. This determined the success of my invention in one of its most important uses, and with a satisfied heart, I put the donkey into the stable and went into our house. Our trip to Europe was made a few months after this, and was mainly on our son Herbert's account. He, poor fellow, was in great trouble, and so therefore were we. He had become engaged, with our full consent, to a young lady in our town, the daughter of a gentleman whom we esteemed very highly. Herbert was young to be engaged to be married, but as we felt that he would never find a girl to make him so good a wife, we were entirely satisfied, especially as it was agreed on all hands that the marriage was not to take place for some time. It seemed to us that in marrying Janet Gilbert, Herbert would secure for himself in the very beginning of his career the most important element of a happy life. But suddenly, without any reason that seemed to us justifiable, Mr. Gilbert, the only surviving parent of Janet, broke off the match, and he and his daughter soon after left the town for a trip to the west. This blow nearly broke poor Herbert's heart. He gave up his professional studies and came home to us, and for a time we thought he would be seriously ill. Then we took him to Europe, and after a continental tour of a month or two, we left him, at his own request, in Göttingen, where he thought it would do him good to go to work again. Then we went down to the little town in Italy where my story first finds us. My wife had suffered much in mind and body on her son's account, and for this reason I was anxious that she should take outdoor exercise and enjoy as much as possible the bracing air of the country. I had brought with me both my little machines. One was still in my knapsack, and the other I had fastened to the inside of an enormous family trunk. As one is obliged to pay for nearly every pound of his baggage on the continent, this saved me a great deal of money. Everything heavy was packed into this great trunk: books, papers, the bronze, iron, and marble relics we had picked up, and all the articles that usually weigh down a tourist's baggage. I screwed up the negative gravity apparatus until the trunk could be handled with great ease by an ordinary porter. I could have made it weigh nothing at all, but this, of course, I did not wish to do. The lightness of my baggage, however, had occasioned some comment, and I had overheard remarks which were not altogether complimentary about people traveling around with empty trunks, but this only amused me. Desirous that my wife should have the advantage of negative gravity while taking our walks, I had removed the machine from the trunk and fastened it inside of the basket, which she could carry under her arm. This assisted her wonderfully. When one arm was tired, she put the basket under the other, and thus, with one hand on my arm, she could easily keep up with the free and buoyant steps my knapsack enabled me to take. She did not object to long tramps here because nobody knew that she was not a walker, and she always carried some wine or other refreshment in the basket, not only because it was pleasant to have it with us, but because it seemed ridiculous to go about carrying an empty basket. There were English-speaking people staying at the hotel where we were, but they seemed more fond of driving than walking, and none of them offered to accompany us on our rambles, for which we were very glad. There was one man there, however, who was a great walker. He was an Englishman, a member of an Alpine club, and generally went about dressed in a knickerbocker suit with grey woolen stockings covering an enormous pair of calves. One evening this gentleman was talking to me and some others about the ascent of the Matterhorn, and I took occasion to deliver in pretty strong language my opinion upon such exploits. I declared them to be useless, foolhardy, and if the climber had anyone who loved him, wicked. Even if the weather should permit a view, I said, what is that compared to the terrible risk to life? Under certain circumstances, I added, thinking of a kind of waistcoat I had some idea of making, which set about with little negative gravity machines, all connected with a conveniently handled screw, would enable the wearer at times to dispense with his weight altogether. Such ascents might be divested of danger and be quite admissible, but ordinarily they should be frowned upon by the intelligent public. The Alpine clubman looked at me, especially regarding my somewhat slight figure and thinnish legs. "It's all very well for you to talk that way," he said, "because it is easy to see that you are not up to that sort of thing." "In conversations of this kind," I replied, "I never make personal allusions, but since you have chosen to do so, I feel inclined to invite you to walk with me tomorrow to the top of the mountain to the north of this town." "I'll do it," he said, "at any time you choose to name." And as I left the room soon afterward, I heard him laugh. The next afternoon, about 2 o'clock,
the Alpine Clubman and myself set out for the mountain.
What have you got in your knapsack? He said.
A hammer to use if I come across geological specimens, a field glass, a flask of wine, and some other things.
I wouldn't carry any weight if I were you, he said.
Oh, I don't mind it, I answered, and off we started. The mountain to which we were bound was about 2 miles from the town. Its nearest side was steep and in places almost precipitous, but it sloped away more gradually towards the north, and up that side a road led by devious windings to a village near the summit. It was not a very high mountain, but it would do for an afternoon's climb.
I suppose you want to go up by the road, said my companion.
Oh, no, I answered. We won't go so far around as that. There's a path up this side along which I've seen men driving goats. I prefer to take that.
All right, if you say so, he answered with a smile. But you'll find it pretty tough.
After a time, he remarked,
I wouldn't walk so fast if I were you.
Oh, I like to step along briskly, I said, and briskly on we went. My wife had screwed up the machine in the knapsack more than usual, and walking seemed scarcely any effort at all. I carried a long alpenstock, and when we reached the mountain and began the ascent, I found that with the help of this and my knapsack, I could go uphill at a wonderful rate. My companion had taken the lead, so as to show me how to climb. Making a detour over some rocks, I quickly passed him and went ahead. After that, it was impossible for him to keep up with me. I ran up steep places, I cut off the windings of the path by lightly clambering over rocks, and even when I followed the beaten track, my step was as rapid as if I had been walking on level ground.
Look here, shouted the Alpine Clubman from below. You'll kill yourself if you go at that rate. That's no way to climb mountains.
It's my way, I cried, and on I skipped. 20 minutes after I arrived at the summit, my companion joined me, puffing and wiping his red face with his handkerchief.
Confound it, he cried. I never came up a mountain so fast in my life.
You need not have hurried, I said coolly.
I was afraid something was going to happen to you, he growled, and I wanted to stop you. I never saw a person climb in such an utterly absurd way.
I don't see why you should call it absurd, I said, smiling with an air of superiority. I arrived here in a perfectly comfortable condition, neither heated nor wearied. He made no answer, but walked off to a little distance, fanning himself with his hat and growling words which I did not catch. After a time, I proposed to descend.
You must be careful as you go down, he said. It's much more dangerous to go down steep places than to climb up.
I am always prudent, I answered, and started in advance. I found the descent of the mountain much more pleasant than the ascent. It was positively exhilarating. I jumped from rocks and bluffs 8 and 10 feet in height and touched the ground as gently as if I had stepped down but 2 feet. I ran down steep paths and with the aid of my alpenstock stopped myself in an instant. I was careful to avoid dangerous places, but the runs and jumps I made were such as no man had ever made before upon that mountainside. Once only I heard my companion's voice.
You'll break your neck,
he yelled. Never fear, I called back, and soon left him far above. When I reached the bottom, I would have waited for him, but my activity had warmed me up, and as a cool evening breeze was beginning to blow, I thought it better not to stop and take cold. Half an hour after my arrival at the hotel, I came down to the court, cool, fresh, and dressed for dinner, and just in time to meet the Alpine man as he entered, hot, dusty, and growling. Excuse me for not waiting for you, I said, but without stopping to hear my reason, he muttered something about waiting in a place where no one would care to stay, and passed into the house. There was no doubt that what I had done gratified my pique and tickled my vanity. I think now, I said when I related the matter to my wife, that he will scarcely say that I am not up to that sort of thing. I'm not sure, she answered, that it was exactly fair. He did not know how you were assisted. I was fair enough, I said. He is enabled to climb well by the inherited vigor of his constitution and by his training. He did not tell me what methods of exercise he used to get those great muscles upon his legs. I am enabled to climb by the exercise of my intellect. My method is my business, and his method is his business. It is all perfectly fair. Still, she persisted, he thought that you climbed with your legs and not with your head. And now, after this long digression necessary to explain how a middle-aged couple of slight pedestrian ability and loaded with a heavy knapsack and basket should have started out on a rough walk and climb 14 miles in all, we will return to ourselves standing on a little bluff and gazing out upon the sunset view. When the sky began to fade a little, we turned from it and prepared to go back to town. Where is the basket? I said. I left it right here, answered my wife. I unscrewed the machine and lay it perfectly flat.
Did you afterwards take out the bottles? I asked, seeing them lying on the grass.
Yes, I believe I did. I had to take out yours in order to get at mine.
Then, said I, after looking all about the grassy patch on which we stood, I'm afraid you did not entirely unscrew the instrument, and that when the weight of the bottles was removed, the basket gently rose into the air.
Oh, it may be so, she said lugubriously. The basket was behind me as I drank my wine.
I believe that is just what happened, I said. Look, up there. I vow that is our basket. I pulled out my field glasses and directed it at a little speck high above our heads. It was the basket floating high in the air. I gave the glass to my wife to look, but she did not want to use it.
What shall I do? She cried. I can't walk home without that basket. It's perfectly dreadful.
And she looked as if she was going to cry. Do not distress yourself, I said, although I was a good deal disturbed myself. We shall get home very well. You shall put your hand on my shoulder while I put my arm around you. Then you can screw up my machine a good deal higher, and it will support us both. In this way, I am sure we shall get on very well. We carried out this plan and managed to walk on with moderate comfort. To be sure, the knapsack pulling me upward and the weight of my wife pulling me down, the straps hurt me somewhat, which they had not done before. We did not spring lightly over the wall into the road, but still clinging to each other, we clambered awkwardly over it. The road, for the most part, declined gently toward the town, and with moderate ease we made our way along it. But we walked much more slowly than we had done before, and it was quite dark when we reached our hotel. If it had not been for the light inside the court, it would have been difficult for us to find it. A traveling carriage was standing before the entrance, and my wife went first. I attempted to follow her, but strange to say, there was nothing under my feet. I stepped vigorously, but only wagged my legs in the air. To my horror, I found that I was rising into the air. I soon saw by the light below me that I was some 15 feet from the ground. The carriage drove away, and in the darkness I was not noticed. Of course, I knew what had happened. The instrument in my knapsack had been screwed up to such an intensity in order to support both myself and my wife that when her weight was removed, the force of the negative gravity was sufficient to raise me from the ground. But I was glad to find that when I had risen to the height I have mentioned, I did not go up any higher, but hung in the air about on the level with the second tier of windows of the hotel. I now began to try to reach the screw in my knapsack in order to reduce the force of the negative gravity, but do what I could not get my hand to it. The machine in the knapsack had been placed so as to support me in a well-balanced and comfortable way, and in doing this, it had been impossible to set the screw so that I could reach it. But in a temporary arrangement of this kind, this had not been considered necessary, as my wife always turned the screw for me until sufficient lifting power had been attained. I had intended, as I have said before, to construct a negative gravity waistcoat in which the screw should be in front and entirely under the wearer's control, but this was a thing of the future. When I found that I could not turn the screw, I began to be much alarmed. Here I was, dangling in the air without any means of reaching the ground. I could not expect my wife to return to look for me, as she would naturally suppose that I had stopped to speak to someone. I thought of loosening myself from the knapsack, but this would not do, for I should fall heavily and either kill myself or break some of my bones. I did not dare to call for assistance, for if any of the simple-minded inhabitants of the town had discovered me floating in the air, they would have taken me for a demon and would probably have shot me. A moderate breeze was blowing, and it wafted me gently down the street. If it had blown me against a tree, I would have seized it and have endeavored, so to speak, to climb down it, but there were no trees. There was a dim street lamp here and there, but reflectors above them threw their light upon the pavement and none up to me. On many accounts I was glad that the night was so dark, for much as I desired to get down, I wanted no one to see me in my strange position, which to anyone but myself and my wife would be utterly unaccountable. If I could rise as high as the roofs, I might get onto one of them, and tearing off an armful of tiles, so load myself that I would be heavy enough to descend, but I did not rise to the eaves of any of the houses. If there had been a telegraph pole or anything of the kind that I could have clung to, I would have taken off the knapsack and would have endeavored to scramble down as well as I could, but there was nothing I could cling to. Even the waterspouts, if I could have reached the face of the houses, were embedded in the walls. At an open window near which I was slowly blown, I saw two little boys going to bed by the light of a dim candle. I was dreadfully afraid that they would see me and raise the alarm. I actually came so near to the window that I threw out one foot and pushed against the wall with such force that I went nearly across the street. I thought I caught sight of a frightened look on the face of one of the boys, but of this I am not sure, and I heard no cries. I still floated dangling down the street. What was to be done? Should I call out? In that case, if I were not shot or stoned, my strange predicament and the secret of my invention would be exposed to the world. If I did not do this, I must either drop and be killed or mangled, or hang there and die. When, during the course of the night, the air became more rarefied, I might rise higher and higher, perhaps to an altitude of 100 or 200 feet. It would then be impossible for the people to reach me and get me down, even if they were convinced that I was not a demon. I should then expire, and when the birds of the air had eaten all of me that they could devour, I should forever hang above the unlucky town, a dangling skeleton with a knapsack on its back. Such thoughts were not reassuring, and I determined that if I could find no means of getting down without assistance, I would call out and run all risks. But so long as I could endure the tension of the straps, I would hold out and hope for a tree or a pole. Perhaps it might rain, and my wet clothes would then become so heavy that I would descend as low as the top of a lamppost. As this thought was passing through my mind, I saw a spark of light upon the street approaching me. I rightly imagined that it came from a tobacco pipe, and presently I heard a voice. It was that of the Alpine Club man. Of all people in the world, I did not want him to discover me, and I hung as motionless as possible. The man was speaking to another person who was walking with him.
"He is crazy beyond a doubt," said the Alpine man. "Nobody but a maniac could have gone up and down that mountain as he did. He hasn't any muscles, and one need only look at him to know that he couldn't do any climbing in a natural way. It's only the excitement of insanity that gives him strength." The two now stopped almost under me, and the speaker continued. "Such things are very common with maniacs. At times they acquire an unnatural strength, which is perfectly wonderful. I have seen a little fellow struggle and fight so that 4 strong men could not hold him." Then the other person spoke. "I am afraid what you say is true," he remarked. "Indeed, I have known it for some time." At these words my breath almost stopped. It was the voice of Mr. Gilbert, my townsman and the father of Janet. It must have been he who had arrived in the travelling carriage. He was acquainted with the Alpine Clubman, and they were talking of me. Proper or improper, I listened with all my ears. "It is a very sad case," Mr. Gilbert continued. "My daughter was engaged to marry his son, but I broke off the match. I could not have her marry the son of a lunatic, and there could be no doubt of his condition. He has been seen, a man of his age and the head of a family, to load himself up with a heavy knapsack which there was no earthly necessity for him to carry, and go skipping along the road for miles, vaulting over fences and jumping over rocks and ditches like a young calf or colt. I myself saw a most heart-rending instance of how a kindly man's nature can be changed by the derangement of his intellect. I was at some distance from his house, but I plainly saw him harness a little donkey which he owns to a large 2-horse wagon loaded with stone, and beat and lash the poor little beast until it drew the heavy load some distance along the public road. I would have remonstrated with him on this horrible cruelty, but he had the wagon back in his yard before I could reach him." "Oh, there can be no doubt of his insanity," said the Alpine Clubman, "and he oughtn't to be allowed to travel about in this way. Some day he will pitch his wife over a precipice just for the fun of seeing her shoot through the air." "I am sorry he is here," said Mr. Gilbert, "for it would be very painful to meet him. My daughter and I will retire very soon and go away as early tomorrow morning as possible, so as to avoid seeing him." And then they walked back to the hotel. For a few moments I hung, utterly forgetful of my condition and absorbed in the consideration of these revelations. One idea now filled my mind. Everything must be explained to Mr. Gilbert, even if it should be necessary to have him called to me and for me to speak to him from the upper air. Just then I saw something white approaching me along the road. My eyes had become accustomed to the darkness, and I perceived that it was an upturned face. I recognized the hurried gait, the form. It was my wife. As she came near me, I called her name, and in the same breath entreated her not to scream. It must have been an effort for her to restrain herself, but she did it. "You must help to get me down," I said, "without anybody seeing us." "What shall I do?" she whispered. "Try to catch hold of this string." Taking a piece of twine from my pocket, I lowered one end to her, but it was too short. She could not reach it. I then tied my handkerchief to it, but it was still not long enough. "I can get more string or handkerchiefs," she whispered hurriedly. "No," I said. "You could not get them up to me.
But leaning against the hotel wall on this side in the corner, just inside the garden gate, are some fishing poles. I've seen them there every day. You can easily find them in the dark. Go, please, and bring me one of those.
The hotel was not far away, and in a few minutes my wife returned with a fishing pole. She stood on tiptoe and reached it high in the air, but all she could do was to strike my feet and legs with it. My most frantic exertions did not enable me to get my hands low enough to touch it. "Wait a minute," she said, and the rod was withdrawn. I knew what she was doing. There was a hook and line attached to the pole, and with womanly dexterity she was fastening the hook to the extreme end of the rod. Soon she reached up and gently struck at my legs. After a few attempts, the hook caught in my trousers, a little below my right knee. Then there was a slight pull, a long scratch down my leg, and the hook was stopped by the top of my boot. Then came a steady downward pull, and I felt myself descending. Gently and firmly the rod was drawn down. Carefully the lower end was kept free from the ground, and in a few moments my ankle was seized with a vigorous grasp. Then someone seemed to climb up me. My feet touched the ground, an arm was thrown around my neck, and the hand of another arm was busy at the back of my knapsack, and I soon stood firmly in the road, entirely divested of my negative gravity.
"Oh, that I should have forgotten," sobbed my wife, "and that I should have dropped your arms and let you go up into the air. At first I thought that you had stayed below, and it was only a little while ago that the truth flashed upon me. Then I rushed out and began looking up for you. I knew that you had wax matches in your pocket and hoped that you would keep on striking them so that you would be seen."
"But I did not wish to be seen," I said as we hurried to the hotel, "and I can never be sufficiently thankful that it was you who found me and brought me down."
"Do you know that it is Mr. Gilbert and his daughter who have just arrived? I must see him instantly. I will explain it all to you when I come upstairs."
I took off my knapsack and gave it to my wife, who carried it to our room, while I went to look for Mr. Gilbert. Fortunately, I found him just as he was about to go up to his chamber. He took my offered hand, but looked at me sadly and gravely. "Mr. Gilbert," I said, "I must speak to you in private. Let us step into this room. There is no one here." "My friend," said Mr. Gilbert, "it will be much better to avoid discussing this subject. It is very painful to both of us, and no good can come from talking of it."
"You cannot now comprehend what it is I want to say to you," I replied. "Come in here, and in a few minutes you will be very glad that you listened to me." My manner was so earnest and impressive that Mr. Gilbert was constrained to follow me. We went into a small room called the smoking room, but in which people seldom smoked, and closed the door. I immediately made my statement. I told my old friend that I had discovered, by means that I need not explain at present, that he had considered me crazy, and that now the most important object of my life was to set myself right in his eyes. I therefore gave him the whole history of my invention, and explained the reason of the actions that had appeared to him those of a lunatic. I said nothing about the little incident of that evening. That was a mere accident, and I did not care now to speak of it. Mr. Gilbert listened to me very attentively. "Your wife is here?" he asked when I'd finished. "Yes," I said, "and she will corroborate my story in every item, and no one would ever suspect her of being crazy. I will go and bring her to you." In a few minutes my wife was in the room, had shaken hands with Mr. Gilbert, and had been told of my suspected madness. She turned pale, but smiled. "He did act like a crazy man," she said, "but I never supposed that anyone would think him one," and tears came into her eyes. "And now, my dear," said I, "perhaps you will tell Mr. Gilbert how I did all this." And then she told him the story that I had told. Mr. Gilbert looked from one to the other of us with a troubled air. "Of course, I do not doubt either of you, or rather I do not doubt that you believe what you say. All would be right if I could bring myself to credit that such a force as that you speak of can possibly exist. That is a matter," said I, "which I can easily prove to you by actual demonstration. If you can wait a short time until my wife and I have had something to eat, for I am nearly famished and I am sure she must be, I will set your mind at rest upon that point." "I will wait here," said Mr. Gilbert, "and smoke a cigar. Don't hurry yourselves. I shall be glad to have some time to think about what you have told me." When we had finished the dinner, which had been set aside for us, I went upstairs and got my knapsack, and we both joined Mr. Gilbert in the smoking room. I showed him the little machine and explained very briefly the principle of its construction. I did not give any practical demonstration of its action, because there were people walking about the corridor who might at any moment come into the room. But looking out of the window, I saw that the night was much clearer. The wind had dissipated the clouds, and the stars were shining brightly. "If you will come up the street with me," said I to Mr. Gilbert, "I will show you how this thing works." "That is just what I want to see," he answered. "I will go with you," said my wife, throwing a shawl over her head, and we started up the street.
When we were outside the little town, I found the starlight was quite sufficient for my purpose. The white roadway, the low walls, and the objects about us could easily be distinguished. "Now," said I to Mr. Gilbert, "I want you to put this knapsack on you and let you see how it feels and how it will help you to walk." To this he assented with some eagerness, and I strapped it firmly to him. "I will now turn this screw," said I, "until you shall become lighter and lighter." "Be very careful not to turn it too much," said my wife earnestly. "Oh, you may depend on me for that," said I, turning the screw very gradually. Mr. Gilbert was a stout man, and I was obliged to give the screw a good many turns. "There seems to be a considerable hoist in it," he said directly, and then I put my arms around him and found that I could raise him from the ground. "Are you lifting me?" he exclaimed in surprise. "Yes, I did, with ease," I answered. "Upon my word!" ejaculated Mr. Gilbert. I then gave the screw a half-turn more and told him to walk and run. He started off at first slowly, then he made long strides, then he began to run, and then to skip and jump. It had been many years since Mr. Gilbert had skipped and jumped. No one was in sight, and he was free to gamble as much as he pleased. "Could you give it another turn?" he said, bounding up to me. "I want to try that wall." I put on a little more negative gravity, and he vaulted over a 5-foot wall with great ease. In an instant he leapt back into the road, and in 2 bounds was at my side. "I came down as light as a cat," he said. "There was never anything like it." And away he went up the road, taking steps at least 8 feet long, leaving my wife and me laughing heartily at the preternatural agility of our stout friend. In a few minutes he was with us again. Take it off," he said. "If I wear it any longer, I shall want one myself, and then I shall be taken for a crazy man and perhaps clapped into an asylum." "Now," said I as I turned back the screw before unstrapping the knapsack, "do you understand how I took long walks and leapt and jumped, how I ran uphill and downhill, and how the little donkey drew the loaded wagon?" "I understand it all," cried he. "I take back all I ever said or thought about you, my friend." "And Herbert may marry Janet?" cried my wife. "May marry her," cried Mr. Gilbert. "Indeed, he shall marry her, if I have anything to say about it. The poor girl has been drooping ever since I told her it could not be." My wife rushed at him, but whether she embraced him or only shook his hands I cannot say, for I had the knapsack in one hand and was rubbing my eyes with the other. "But, my dear fellow," said Mr. Gilbert directly, "if you still consider it in your interest to keep your invention a secret, I wish you had never made it. No one having a machine like that can help using it, and it is often quite as bad to be considered a maniac as to be one." "My friend," I cried with some excitement, "I have made up my mind on this subject. The little machine in this knapsack, which is the only one I now possess, has been a great pleasure to me. But I now know it has also been of the greatest injury indirectly to me and mine, not to mention some direct inconvenience and danger, which I will speak of another time. The secret lies with us 3, and we will keep it. But the invention itself is too full of temptation and danger for any of us." As I said this, I held the knapsack with one hand while I quickly turned the screw with the other. In a few moments it was high above my head, while I with difficulty held it down by the straps. "Look!" I cried, and then I released my hold, and the knapsack shot into the air and disappeared into the upper gloom. I was about to make a remark, but had no chance, for my wife threw herself upon my bosom, sobbing with joy. "Oh, I am so glad, she said, "and you will never make another?" "Never another," I answered. "And now let us hurry and see Janet," said my wife. "You don't know how heavy and clumsy I feel," said Mr. Gilbert, striving to keep up with us as he walked back. "If I had worn that thing much longer, I should never have been willing to take it off." Janet had retired, but my wife went up to her room. "I think she felt it as much as our boy," she said when she rejoined me. "But I tell you, my dear, I left a very happy girl in that little bedchamber over the garden." And there were 3 very happy elderly people talking together until quite late that evening. "I shall write to Herbert tonight," I said when we separated, "and tell him to meet us all in Geneva. It will do the young man no harm if we interrupt his studies just now." "You must let me add a postscript to the letter," said Mr. Gilbert, "and I am sure it will require no knapsack with a screw in the back to bring him quickly to us." And it did not. There is a wonderful pleasure in tripping over the earth like a winged Mercury, and in feeling oneself relieved of much of that attraction of gravitation that drags us down to earth and gradually makes the movement of our bodies but weariness and labor. But this pleasure is not to be compared, I think, to that given by the buoyancy and lightness of 2 young and loving hearts, reunited after a separation which they had supposed would last forever. What became of the basket and the knapsack, or whether they ever met in upper air, I do not know. If they but float away and stay away from ken of mortal man, I shall be satisfied. And whether or not the world will ever know more of the power of negative gravity depends entirely upon the disposition of my son Herbert, when, after a good many years, I hope, he shall open the packet my lawyers have in keeping. Note, it would be quite useless for anyone to interview my wife on this subject, for she has entirely forgotten how the machine was made, and as for Mr. Gilbert, well, he never knew. Dr. Heidegger's Experiment by Nathaniel Hawthorne. That very singular man, old Dr. Heidegger, once invited 4 venerable friends to meet him in his study. There were 3 white-bearded gentlemen, Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, and Mr. Gascoigne, and a withered gentlewoman whose name was the Widow Wycherley. They were all melancholy old creatures who had been unfortunate in life, and whose greatest misfortune it was that they were not long ago in their graves. Mr. Medbourne, in the vigour of his age, had been a prosperous merchant, but had lost his all by a frantic speculation, and was now little better than a mendicant. Colonel Killigrew had wasted his best years and his health and substance in the pursuit of sinful pleasures, which had given birth to a brood of pains, such as gout and divers other torments of his soul and body. Mr. Gascoigne was a ruined politician, a man of evil fame, or at least had been so, till time had buried him from the knowledge of the present generation and made him obscure instead of infamous. As for the Widow Wycherley, tradition tells us that she was a great beauty in her day, but for a long while past she had lived in deep seclusion on account of certain scandalous stories which had prejudiced the gentry of the town against her. It is a circumstance worth mentioning that each of these 3 old gentlemen, Mr. Medbourne, Colonel Killigrew, and Mr. Gascoigne, were early lovers of the Widow Wycherley, and had once been on the point of cutting each other's throats for her sake. And before proceeding further, I will merely hint that Dr. Heidegger and all his 4 guests were sometimes thought to be a little beside themselves, as is not infrequently the case with old people when worried either by present troubles or woeful recollections. "My dear old friends," said Dr. Heidegger, motioning them to be seated, "I am desirous of your assistance in one of those little experiments with which I amuse myself here in my study." If all stories were true, Dr. Heidegger's study must have been a very curious place. It was a dim, old-fashioned chamber, festooned with cobwebs and besprinkled with antique dust. Around the walls stood several oaken bookcases, the lower shelves of which were filled with rows of gigantic folios and black-letter quartos, and the upper with little parchment-covered duodecimers. Over the central bookcase was a bronze bust of Hippocrates, with which, according to some authorities, Dr. Heidegger was accustomed to hold consultations in all difficult cases of his practice. In the obscurest corner of the room stood a tall and narrow oaken closet, with its door ajar, within which doubtfully appeared a skeleton. Between 2 of the bookcases hung a looking-glass, presenting its high and dusty plate within a tarnished gilt frame. Among many wonderful stories related of this mirror, it was fabled that the spirits of all the doctor's deceased patients dwelt within its verge and would stare him in the face whenever he looked thitherward. The opposite side of the chamber was ornamented with a full-length portrait of a young lady arrayed in faded magnificence of silk, satin and brocade, and with a visage as faded as her dress. Above half a century ago, Dr. Heidegger had been on the point of marriage to this young lady, but being affected with some slight disorder, she had swallowed one of her lover's prescriptions and died on the bridal evening. The greatest curiosity of the study remained to be mentioned. It was a ponderous folio volume bound in black leather with massive silver clasps. There were no letters on the back, and nobody could tell the title of the book, but it was well known to be a book of magic, and once, when a chambermaid had lifted it, merely to brush away the dust, the skeleton had rattled in its closet, the picture of the young lady had stepped 1 foot upon the floor, and several ghastly faces had peeped forth from the mirror, while the brazen head of Hippocrates frowned and said, "Forbear." Such was Dr. Heidegger's study. On the summer afternoon of our tale, a small round table, as black as ebony, stood in the centre of the room, sustaining a cut-glass vase of beautiful form and elaborate workmanship. The sunshine came through the window between the heavy festoons of 2 faded damask curtains and fell directly across this vase, so that a mild splendour was reflected from it on the ashen visages of the 5 old people who sat around. 4 champagne glasses were also on the table. "My dear old friends," repeated Dr. Heidegger, "may I reckon on your aid in performing an exceedingly curious experiment?" Now, Dr. Heidegger was a very strange old gentleman, whose eccentricity had become the nucleus of 1,000 fantastic stories. Some of these fables, to my shame be it spoken, might possibly be traced back to mine own voracious self, and if any passages of the present tale should startle the listener's faith, I must be content to bear the stigma of a fiction-monger. When the doctor's 4 guests heard him talk of his proposed experiment, they anticipated nothing more wonderful than the murder of a mouse in an air pump, or the examination of a cobweb by the microscope, or some similar nonsense with which he was constantly in the habit of pestering his intimates. But without waiting for a reply, Dr. Heidegger hobbled across the chamber and returned with the same ponderous folio bound in black leather, which common report affirmed to be a book of magic. Undoing the silver clasps, he opened the volume and took from its black letter pages a rose, or what was once a rose, though now the green leaves and crimson petals had assumed one brownish hue, and the ancient flower seemed ready to crumble to dust in the doctor's hands. "This rose," said Dr. Heidegger with a sigh, "this same withered and crumbling flower blossomed 55 years ago. It was given me by Sylvia Ward, whose portrait hangs yonder, and I meant to wear it in my bosom at our wedding. 55 years it has been treasured between the leaves of this old volume. Now, would you deem it possible that this rose of half a century could ever bloom again?" "Nonsense," said the widow Wycherley, with a peevish toss of her head. "You might as well ask whether an old woman's wrinkled face could ever bloom again." "See," answered Dr. Heidegger. He uncovered the vase and threw the faded rose into the water which it contained. At first it lay lightly on the surface of the fluid, appearing to imbibe none of its moisture. Soon, however, a singular change began to be visible. The crushed and dried petals stirred and assumed a deepening tinge of crimson, as if the flower were reviving from a death-like slumber. The slender stalk and twigs of foliage became green, and there was the rose of half a century, looking as fresh as when Sylvia Ward had first given it to her lover. It was scarcely full-blown, for some of its delicate red leaves curled modestly around its moist bosom, within which 2 or 3 dewdrops were sparkling. "That is certainly a very pretty deception," said the doctor's friends, carelessly, however, for they had witnessed greater miracles at a conjurer's show. "Pray, how was it effected?" "Did you never hear of the Fountain of Youth?" asked Dr. Heidegger, "which Ponce de Leon, the Spanish adventurer, went in search of 2 or 3 centuries ago?" "But did Ponce de Leon ever find it?" said the widow Wycherley. "No," answered Dr. Heidegger, "for he never sought it in the right place. The famous Fountain of Youth, if I am rightly informed, is situated in the southern part of the Floridian Peninsula, not far from Lake Macaco. Its source is overshadowed by several gigantic magnolias, which, though numberless centuries old, have been kept as fresh as violets by the virtues of this wonderful water. An acquaintance of mine, knowing my curiosity in such matters, has sent me what you see in the vase." said Colonel Killigrew, who believed not a word of the doctor's story. "And what may be the effect of this fluid on the human frame?" "You shall judge for yourself, my dear Colonel," replied Dr. Heidegger. "And all of you, my respected friends, are welcome to so much of this admirable fluid as may restore you to the bloom of youth. For my own part, having had much trouble in growing old, I am in no hurry to grow young again. With your permission, therefore, I will merely watch the progress of the experiment." While he spoke, Dr. Heidegger had been filling the 4 champagne glasses with the water of the Fountain of Youth. It was apparently impregnated with an effervescent gas, for little bubbles were continually ascending from the depths of the glasses and bursting in silvery spray at the surface. As the liquor diffused a pleasant perfume, the old people doubted now that it possessed cordial and comfortable properties, and though utter skeptics as to its rejuvenescent power, they were inclined to swallow it at once. But Dr. Heidegger besought them to stay a moment. "Before you drink, my respectable old friend," said he, "it would be well that, with the experience of a lifetime to direct you, you should draw up a few general rules for your guidance in passing a second time through the perils of youth. Think what a sin and shame it would be if, with your peculiar advantages, you should not become patterns of virtue and wisdom to all the young people of the age." The doctor's 4 venerable friends made him no answer, except by a feeble and tremulous laugh, so very ridiculous was the idea that, knowing how closely repentance treads behind the steps of error, they should ever go astray again. "Drink, then," said the doctor, bowing. I rejoice that I have so well selected the subjects of my experiment. With palsied hands, they raised the glasses to their lips. The liquor, if it really possessed such virtues as Dr. Heidegger imputed to it, could not have been bestowed on 4 human beings who needed it more woefully. They looked as if they had never known what youth or pleasure was, but had been the offspring of nature's dotage, and always the grey, decrepit, sapless, miserable creatures who now sat stooping round the doctor's table, without life enough in their souls or bodies to be animated even by the prospect of growing young again. They drank off the water and replaced their glasses on the table. Assuredly, there was an almost immediate improvement in the aspect of the party, not unlike what might have been produced by a glass of generous wine, together with a sudden glow of cheerful sunshine brightening over all their visages at once. There was a healthful suffusion on their cheeks instead of the ashen hue that had made them look so corpse-like. They gazed at one another and fancied that some magic power had really begun to smooth away the deep and sad inscriptions which Father Time had been so long engraving on their brows. The widow Wycherley adjusted her cap, for she felt almost like a woman again.
"Give us more of this wondrous water," cried they eagerly. "We are younger, but we are still too old. Quick, give us more."
"Patience, patience," quoth Dr. Heidegger, who sat watching the experiment with philosophic coolness. "You have been a long time growing old. Surely you might be content to grow young in half an hour. But the water is at your service." Again he filled their glasses with the liquor of youth, enough of which still remained in the vase to turn half the old people in the city to the age of their own grandchildren. While the bubbles were yet sparkling on the brim, the doctor's 4 guests snatched their glasses from the table and swallowed the contents at a single gulp. Was it delusion? Even while the draught was passing down their throats, it seemed to have wrought a change on their whole systems. Their eyes grew clear and bright. A dark shade deepened among their silvery locks, and they sat around the table, 3 gentlemen of middle age, and a woman hardly beyond her buxom prime.
"My dear widow, you are charming," cried Colonel Killigrew, whose eyes had been fixed upon her face, while the shadows of age were flitting from it like darkness from the crimson daybreak. The fair widow knew of old that Colonel Killigrew's compliments were not always measured by sober truth, so she started up and ran to the mirror, still dreading that the ugly visage of an old woman would meet her gaze. Meanwhile, the 3 gentlemen behaved in such a manner as proved that the water of the Fountain of Youth possessed some intoxicating qualities, unless indeed their exhilaration of spirits were merely a lightsome dizziness caused by the sudden removal of the weight of years. Mr. Gascoigne's mind seemed to run on political topics, but whether relating to the past, present, or future could not easily be determined, since the same ideas and phrases have been in vogue these 50 years. Now he rattled forth full-throated sentences about patriotism, national glory, and the people's right. Now he muttered some perilous stuff or other in a sly and doubtful whisper, so cautiously that even his own conscience could scarcely catch the secret. And now again he spoke in measured accents and a deeply deferential tone, as if a royal ear were listening to his well-turned periods. Colonel Killigrew all this time had been trolling forth a jolly bottle song and ringing his glass in symphony with the chorus, while his eyes wandered toward the buxom figure of Widow Wycherley. On the other side of the table, Mr. Megbourne was involved in a calculation of dollars and cents, with which was strangely intermingled a project for supplying the East Indies with ice by harnessing a team of whales to the polar icebergs. As for the Widow Wycherley, she stood before the mirror, curtsying and simpering to her own image, and greeting it as the friend whom she loved better than all the world beside. She thrust her face close to the glass to see whether some long-remembered wrinkle or crow's foot had indeed vanished. She examined whether the snow had so entirely melted from her hair that the venerable cap could be safely thrown aside. At last, turning briskly away, she came with a sort of dancing step to the table. "My dear old doctor," cried she, "pray favour me with another glass."
"Certainly, my dear madam, certainly," replied the complacent doctor. "See, I have already filled the glasses." There in fact stood the 4 glasses, brim full of this wonderful water, the delicate spray of which, as it effervesced from the surface, resembled the tremulous glitter of diamonds. It was now so nearly sunset that the chamber had grown duskier than ever, but a mild and moon-like splendour gleamed from within the vase, and rested alike on the 4 guests and on the doctor's venerable figure. He sat in a high-backed, elaborately carved oaken armchair, with a grey dignity of aspect that might have well befitted that very Father Time whose power had never been disputed, save by this fortunate company. Even while quaffing the third draught of the Fountain of Youth, they were almost awed by the expression of his mysterious visage. But the next moment, the exhilarating gush of young life shot through their veins. They were now in the happy prime of youth. Age, with his miserable train of cares and sorrows and diseases, was remembered only as the trouble of a dream from which they had joyously awoke. The fresh gloss of the soul, so early lost, and without which the world's successive scenes had been but a gallery of faded pictures, again threw its enchantment over all their prospects. They felt like new created beings in a new created universe. "We are young! We are young!" they cried exultingly. Youth, like the extremity of age, had effaced the strongly marked characteristics of middle life and mutually assimilated them all. They were a group of merry youngsters, almost maddened with the exuberant frolicsomeness of their years. The most singular effect of their gaiety was an impulse to mock the infirmity and decrepitude of which they had so lately been the victims. They laughed loudly at their old-fashioned attire, the wide-skirted coats and flapped waistcoats of the young men, and the ancient cap and gown of the blooming girl. One limped across the floor like a gouty grandfather. One set a pair of spectacles astride of his nose and pretended to pore over the black-letter pages of the Book of Magic. A third seated himself in an armchair and strove to imitate the venerable dignity of Dr. Heidegger. They all shouted mirthfully and leapt about the room. The widow Wycherley, if so fresh a damsel could be called a widow, tripped up to the doctor's chair with a mischievous merriment in her rosy face. "Doctor, you dear old soul," cried she, "get up and dance with me." And then the four young people laughed louder than ever to think what a queer figure the poor old doctor would cut. "Pray excuse me," answered the doctor quietly. "I am old and rheumatic, and my dancing days were over long ago. But either of these gay young gentlemen will be glad of so pretty a partner." "Dance with me, Clara," cried Colonel Killigrew. "No, I will be her partner," shouted Mr. Gascoigne. "She promised me her hand 50 years ago," exclaimed Mr. Medbourne. They all gathered around her. One caught both her hands in his passionate grasp, another threw his arm about her waist. The third buried his hand among the glossy curls that clustered beneath the widow's cap. Blushing, panting, struggling, chiding, laughing, her warm breath fanning each of their faces by turns, she strove to disengage herself, yet still remained in their triple embrace. Never was there a livelier picture of youthful rivalship, with bewitching beauty for the prize. Yet, by a strange deception, owing to the duskiness of the chamber and the antique dresses which they still wore, the tall mirror is said to have reflected the figures of 3 old, grey, withered grandsires, ridiculously contending for the skinny ugliness of a shriveled grandame. But they were young. Their burning passions proved them so. Inflamed to madness by the coquetry of the girl widow, who neither granted nor quite withheld her favours, the 3 rivals began to interchange threatening glances. Still keeping hold of the fair prize, they grappled fiercely at one another's throats. As they struggled to and fro, the table was overturned, and the vase dashed into 1,000 fragments. The precious water of youth flowed in a bright stream across the floor, moistening the wings of a butterfly, which, grown old in the decline of summer, had alighted there to die. The insect fluttered lightly through the chamber and settled on the snowy head of Dr. Heidegger. Come, gentlemen, come, Madam Wycherley," exclaimed the doctor. "I really must protest against this riot." They stood still and shivered, for it seemed as if grey time were calling them back from their sunny youth, far down into the chill and darksome vale of years. They looked at old Dr. Heidegger, who sat in his curved armchair, holding the rose of half a century, which he had rescued from among the fragments of the shattered vase. At the motion of his hand, the 4 rioters resumed their seats, the more readily because their violent exertions had wearied them, youthful though they were. "My poor Sylvia's rose," ejaculated Dr. Heidegger, holding it in the light of the sunset clouds. "It appears to be fading again." And so it was. Even while the party were looking at it, the flower continued to shrivel up till it became as dry and fragile as when the doctor had first thrown it into the vase. He shook off the few drops of moisture which clung to its petals. "I love it as well thus, as in its dewy freshness," observed he, pressing the withered rose to his withered lips. While he spoke, the butterfly fluttered down from the doctor's snowy head and fell upon the floor. His guests shivered again. A strange chillness, whether of the body or spirit they could not tell, was creeping gradually over them all. They gazed at one another and fancied that each fleeting moment snatched away a charm,
and left a deepening furrow where none had been before. Was it an illusion? Had the changes of a lifetime been crowded into so brief a space? And were they now 4 aged people sitting with their old friend Dr. Heidegger? "Are we grown old again so soon?" cried they dolefully. In truth, they had. The water of youth possessed merely a virtue more transient than that of wine. The delirium which it created had effervesced away. Yes, they were old again. With a shuddering impulse that showed her a woman still, the widow clasped her skinny hands before her face and wished that the coffin lid were over it, since it could no longer be beautiful. "Yes, friends, ye are old again," said Dr. Heidegger, "and lo, the water of youth is all lavished on the ground. Well, I bemoan it not, for if the fountain gushed at my doorstep, I would not stoop to bathe my lips in it. No, though its delirium were for years instead of moments. Such is the lesson ye have taught me." But the doctor's 4 friends had taught no such lesson to themselves. They resolved forthwith to make a pilgrimage to Florida and quaff at morning, noon and night from the fountain of youth.
1,000 Deaths by Jack London. I had been in the water about an hour, and cold, exhausted, with a terrible cramp in my right calf, it seemed as though my hour had come. Fruitlessly struggling against the strong ebb tide, I had beheld the maddening procession of the waterfront lights slip by. But now I gave up attempting to breast the stream, and contented myself with the bitter thoughts of a wasted career now drawing to a close. It had been my luck to come of good English stock, but of parents whose account with the bankers far exceeded their knowledge of child nature and the rearing of children. While born with a silver spoon in my mouth, the blessed atmosphere of the home circle was to me unknown. My father, a very learned man and a celebrated antiquarian, gave no thought to his family, being constantly lost in the abstractions of his study, while my mother, noted far more for her good looks than her good sense, sated herself with the adulation of the society in which she was perpetually plunged. I went through the regular school and college routine of a boy of the English bourgeoisie, and as the years brought me increasing strength and passions, my parents suddenly became aware that I was possessed of an immortal soul and endeavored to draw the curb. But it was too late. I perpetrated the wildest and most audacious folly, and was disowned by my people, ostracized by the society I had so long outraged, and with £1,000 my father gave me, with the declaration that he would neither see me again nor give me more, I took a first-class passage to Australia. Since then, my life had been one long peregrination, from the Orient to the Occident, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, to find myself at last, able seaman at 30, in the full vigor of my manhood, drowning in San Francisco Bay because of a disastrously successful attempt to desert my ship. My right leg was drawn up by the cramp, and I was suffering the keenest agony. A slight breeze stirred up a choppy sea, which washed into my mouth and down my throat, nor could I prevent it, though I still contrived to keep afloat. It was merely mechanical, for I was rapidly becoming unconscious. I have a dim recollection of drifting past the sea wall and of catching a glimpse of an upriver steamer's starboard light. Then everything became a blank. I heard the low hum of insect life and felt the balmy air of a spring morning fanning my cheek. Gradually, it assumed a rhythmic flow, to whose soft pulsations my body seemed to respond. I floated on the gentle bosom of a summer's sea, rising and falling with dreamy pleasure on each crooning wave. But the pulsations grew stronger, the humming louder, the waves larger, fiercer. I was dashed about on a stormy sea. A great agony fastened upon me. Brilliant, intermittent sparks of light flashed athwart my inner consciousness. In my ears was the sound of many waters, then a sudden snapping of an intangible something, and I awoke. The scene of which I was protagonist was a curious one. A glance sufficed to inform me that I lay on the cabin floor of some gentleman's yacht in a most uncomfortable posture. On either side, grasping my arms and working them up and down like pump handles, were 2 peculiarly clad, dark-skinned creatures. Though conversant with most aboriginal types, I could not conjecture their nationality. Some attachment had been fastened about my head, which connected my respiratory organs with the machine I shall next describe. My nostrils, however, had been closed, forcing me to breathe through the mouth.
Foreshortened by the obliquity of my line of vision, I beheld two tubes, similar to small hosing, but of different composition, which emerged from my mouth and went off at an acute angle from each other. The first came to an abrupt termination and lay on the floor beside me. The second traversed the floor in numerous coils, connecting with the apparatus I have promised to describe. In the days before my life became tangential, I had dabbled not a little in science, and conversant with the appurtenances and general paraphernalia of the laboratory, I appreciated the machine I now beheld. It was composed chiefly of glass, the construction being of that crude sort which is employed for experimentative purposes. A vessel of water was surrounded by an air chamber, to which was fixed a vertical tube surmounted by a globe. In the center of this was a vacuum gauge. The water of the tube moved upwards and downwards, creating alternate inhalations and exhalations, which were in turn communicated to me through the hose. With this, and the aid of the men who pumped my arm so vigorously, had the process of breathing been artificially carried on, my chest rising and falling, and my lungs expanding and contracting, till nature could be persuaded to again take up her wonted labor. As I opened my eyes, the appliance about my head, nostrils, and mouth was removed. Draining a stiff 3 fingers of brandy, I staggered to my feet to thank my preserver, and confronted my father. But long years of fellowship with danger had taught me self-control, and I waited to see if he would recognize me. Not so. He saw in me no more than a runaway sailor and treated me accordingly. Leaving me to the care of the black servants, he fell to revising the notes he had made on my resuscitation. As I ate the handsome fare served up to me, confusion began on deck, and from the chanties of the sailors and the rattling of blocks and tackles, I surmised that we were getting under way. What a lark! Off on a cruise with my recluse father into the wide Pacific. Little did I realize as I laughed to myself which side the joke was to be on. Aye, had I known, I would have plunged overboard and welcomed the dirty forecastle from which I had just escaped. I could not suspect that he had his own ends in view in keeping my present secrets to all, save the crew. He told me briefly of my rescue by his sailors, assuring me that the obligation was on his side, as my appearance had been most opportune. He had constructed the apparatus for the vindication of a theory concerning certain biological phenomena, and had been waiting for an opportunity to use it. "You have proved it beyond all doubt," he said, then added with a sigh, "but only in the small matter of drowning." But to take a reef in my yarn, he offered me an advance of £2 on my previous wages to sail with him, and this I considered handsome, for he really did not need me. Contrary to my expectations, I did not join the sailors' mess forward, being assigned to a comfortable stateroom and eating at the captain's table. He had perceived that I was no common sailor, and I resolved to take this chance for reinstating myself in his good graces. I wove a fictitious past to account for my education and present position, and did my best to come in touch with him. I was not long in disclosing a predilection for scientific pursuits, nor he in appreciating my aptitude. I became his assistant, with a corresponding increase in wages, and before long, as he grew confidential and expounded his theories, I was as enthusiastic as himself. The days flew quickly by, for I was deeply interested in my new studies, passing my waking hours in his well-stocked library, or listening to his plans and aiding him in his laboratory work. But we were forced to forego many enticing experiments, a rolling ship not being exactly the proper place for delicate or intricate work. He promised me, however, many delightful hours in the magnificent laboratory for which we were bound. He had taken possession of an uncharted South Sea island, as he said, and turned it into a scientific paradise. We had not been on the island long before I discovered the horrible mare's nest I had fallen into. But before I describe the strange things which came to pass, I must briefly outline the causes which culminated in as startling an experience as ever fell to the lot of man. Late in life, my father had abandoned the musty charms of antiquity and succumbed to the more fascinating ones embraced under the general head of biology. Having been thoroughly grounded during his youth in the fundamentals, he rapidly explored all the higher branches as far as the scientific world had gone, and found himself on the no-man's land of the unknowable. It was his intention to preempt some of this unclaimed territory, and it was at this stage of his investigations that we had been thrown together. Having a good brain, though I say it myself, I had mastered his speculations and methods of reasoning, becoming almost as mad as himself. But I should not say this. The marvelous results we afterwards obtained can only go to prove his sanity. I can but say that he was the most abnormal specimen of cold-blooded cruelty I have ever seen. After having penetrated the dual mysteries of pathology and psychology, his thought had led him to the verge of a great field, for which, the better to explore, he began studies in higher organic chemistry, pathology, toxicology, and other sciences and sub-sciences rendered kindred as accessories to his speculative hypotheses. Starting from the proposition that the direct cause of the temporary and permanent array of vitality was due to the coagulation of certain elements and compounds in the protoplasm, he had isolated and subjected these various substances to innumerable experiments. Since the temporary arrest of vitality in an organism brought coma, and the permanent arrest death, he held that by artificial means this coagulation of the protoplasm could be retarded, prevented, and even overcome in the extreme states of solidification. Or to do away with the technical nomenclature, he argued that death, when not violent, and in which none of the organs had suffered injury, was merely suspended vitality, and that in such circumstances, life could be induced to resume its functions by the use of proper methods. This then was his idea: to discover the method, and by practical experimentation prove the possibility, of renewing vitality in a structure from which life had seemingly fled. Of course, he recognized the futility of such endeavor after decomposition had set in. He must have organisms which, but the moment, the hour, or the day before, had been quick with life. With me, in a crude way, he had proved this theory. I was really drowned, really dead, when picked up from the water of San Francisco Bay. But the vital spark had been renewed by means of his aerotherapeutical apparatus, as he called it. Now to his dark purpose concerning me. He first showed me how completely I was in his power. He had sent the yacht away for a year, retaining only his 2 black servants, who were utterly devoted to him. He then made an exhaustive review of his theory and outlined the method of proof he had adopted, concluding with the startling announcement that I was to be his subject. I had faced death and weighed my chances in many a desperate venture, but never in one of this nature. I can swear I am no coward, yet this proposition of journeying back and forth across the borderland of death put the yellow fear in me. I asked for time, which he granted, at the same time assuring me that but one course was open. I must submit. Escape from the island was out of the question. Escape by suicide was not to be entertained, though really preferable to what it seemed I must undergo. My only hope was to destroy my captors, but this latter was frustrated through the precautions taken by my father. I was subjected to a constant surveillance, even in my sleep being guarded by one or other of the servants. Having pleaded in vain, I announced and proved that I was his son. It was my last card, and I had placed all my hopes upon it. But he was inexorable. He was not a father, but a scientific machine. I wonder yet how it ever came to pass that he married my mother or begat me, for there was not the slightest grain of emotion in his makeup. Reason was all in all to him, nor could he understand such things as love or sympathy in others, except as petty weaknesses which should be overcome. So he informed me that in the beginning he had given me life, and who had better right to take it away than he. Such, he said, was not his desire, however. He merely wished to borrow it occasionally, promising to return it punctually at the appointed time. Of course, there was a liability of mishaps, but I could do no more than take the chances, since the affairs of men were full of such. The better to ensure success, he wished me to be in the best possible condition. So I was dieted and trained like a great athlete before a decisive contest. What could I do? If I had to undergo the peril, it were best to be in good shape. In my intervals of relaxation, he allowed me to assist in the arranging of the apparatus and in the various subsidiary experiments. The interest I took in all such operations can be imagined. I mastered the work as thoroughly as he, and often had the pleasure of seeing some of my suggestions of alterations put into effect. After such events, I would smile grimly, conscious of officiating at my own funeral. He began by inaugurating a series of experiments in toxicology. When all was ready, I was killed by a stiff dose of strychnine and allowed to lie dead for some 20 hours. During that period, my body was dead, absolutely dead. All respiration and circulation ceased, but the frightful part of it was that while the protoplasmic coagulation proceeded, I retained consciousness and was able to study it in all its ghastly details. The apparatus to bring me back to life was an airtight chamber fitted to receive my body. The mechanism was simple. A few valves, a rotary shaft and crank, and an electric motor. When in operation, the interior atmosphere was alternately condensed and rarefied, thus communicating to my lungs an artificial respiration without the agency of the hosing previously used. Though my body was inert, and for all I knew, in the first stages of decomposition, I was cognizant of everything that transpired. I knew when they placed me in the chamber, and though all my senses were quiescent, I was aware of hypodermic injections of a compound to react upon the coagulatory process. Then the chamber was closed, and the machinery started. My anxiety was terrible, but the circulation became gradually restored. The different organs began to carry on their respective functions, and in an hour's time, I was eating a hearty dinner. It cannot be said that I participated in this series, nor in the subsequent ones, with much verve, but after 2 ineffectual attempts at escape, I began to take quite an interest. Besides, I was becoming accustomed. My father was beside himself in success, and as the months rolled by, his speculations took wilder and yet wilder flights. We ranged through the 3 great classes of poisons, the neurotics, the gaseous, and the irritants, but carefully avoided some of the mineral irritants and passed up the whole group of corrosives. During the poison regime, I became quite accustomed to dying and had but one mishap to shake my growing confidence. Scarifying a number of lesser blood vessels in my arm, he introduced a minute quantity of that most frightful of poisons, the arrow poison, or curare. I lost consciousness at the start, quickly followed by the cessation of respiration and circulation, and so far had the solidification of the protoplasm advanced that he gave up all hope. But at the last moment, he applied a discovery he had been working upon, receiving such encouragement as to redouble his efforts. In a glass vacuum, similar but not exactly like a Crookes tube, was placed a magnetic field. When penetrated by polarized light, it gave no phenomena of phosphorescence nor of rectilinear projection of atoms, but emitted non-luminous rays similar to the X-ray. While the X-ray could reveal opaque objects hidden in dense mediums, this was possessed of far subtler penetration. By this, he photographed my body and found on the negative an infinite number of blurred shadows due to the chemical and electric motion still going on. This was infallible proof that the rigor mortis in which I lay was not genuine. That is, those mysterious forces, those delicate bonds which held my soul to my body, were still in action. The resultants of all other poisons were unapparent, save those of mercurial compounds, which usually left me languid for several days. Another series of delightful experiments was with electricity. We verified Tesla's assertion that high currents were utterly harmless by passing 100,000 volts through my body. As this did not affect me, the current was reduced to 2,500, and I was quickly electrocuted. This time he ventured so far as to allow me to remain dead or in a state of suspended vitality for 3 days. It took 4 hours to bring me back. Once he superinduced lockjaw, but the agony of dying was so great that I positively refused to undergo similar experiments. The easiest deaths were by asphyxiation, such as drowning, strangling, and suffocation by gas, while those by morphine, opium, cocaine, and chloroform were not hard at all. Another time, after being suffocated, he kept me in cold storage for 3 months, not permitting me to freeze or decay. This was without my knowledge, and I was in a great fright on discovering the lapse of time. I became afraid of what he might do with me when I lay dead, my alarm being increased by the predilection he was beginning to betray towards vivisection. The last time I was resurrected, I discovered that he'd been tampering with my breast. Though he had carefully dressed and sewed the incisions up, they were so severe that I had to take to my bed for some time. It was during my convalescence that I evolved the plan by which I ultimately escaped. While feigning unbounded enthusiasm in the work, I asked and received a vacation from my moribund occupation. During this period, I devoted myself to laboratory work, while he was too deep in the vivisection of the many animals captured by the servants to take notice of my work. It was on these 2 propositions that I constructed my theory. First, electrolysis, or the decomposition of water into its constituent gases by means of electricity. And second, by the hypothetical existence of a force, the converse of gravitation, which Astor has named apogee. Terrestrial attraction, for instance, merely draws objects together but does not combine them. Hence, apogee is merely repulsion. Now, atomic or molecular attraction not only draws objects together, but integrates them. And it was the converse of this, or a disintegrative force, which I wished not only to discover and produce, but to direct at will. Thus, the molecules of hydrogen and oxygen reacting on each other separate and create new molecules containing both elements and forming water. Electrolysis causes these molecules to split up and resume their original condition, producing the two gases separately. The force I wish to find must not only do this with two, but with all elements, no matter in what compounds they exist. If I could then entice my father within its radius, he would be instantly disintegrated and sent flying to the four quarters, a mass of isolated elements. It must not be understood that this force which I finally came to control annihilated matter. It merely annihilated form. Nor, as I soon discovered, had it any effect on inorganic structure, but to all organic form it was absolutely fatal. This partiality puzzled me at first, though had I stopped to think deeper, I would have seen through it. Since the number of atoms in organic molecules is far greater than in the most complex mineral molecules, organic compounds are characterized by their instability and the ease with which they are split up by physical forces and chemical reagents. By two powerful batteries, connected with magnets, constructed especially for this purpose, two tremendous forces were projected. Considered apart from each other, they were perfectly harmless, but they accomplished their purpose by focusing at an invisible point in mid-air. After practically demonstrating its success, besides narrowly escaping being blown into nothingness, I laid my trap. Concealing the magnets so that their force made the whole space of my chamber doorway a field of death, and placing by my couch a button by which I could throw on the current from the storage batteries, I climbed into bed. The servants still guarded my sleeping quarters, one relieving the other at midnight. I turned on the current as soon as the first man arrived. Hardly had I begun to doze when I was aroused by a sharp metallic tinkle. There, on the mid-threshold, lay the collar of Dan, my father's St. Bernard. My keeper ran to pick it up. He disappeared like a gust of wind, his clothes falling to the floor in a heap. There was a slight whiff of ozone in the air, but since the principal gaseous components of his body were oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, which are equally colourless and odourless, there was no other manifestation of his departure. Yet, when I shut off the current and removed the garments, I found a deposit of carbon in the form of animal charcoal. Also other powders, the isolated, solid elements of his organism, such as sulfur, potassium, and iron. Resetting the trap, I crawled back to bed. At midnight, I got up and removed the remains of the second servant, and then slept peacefully till morning. I was awakened by the strident voice of my father, who was calling to me from across the laboratory. I laughed to myself. There had been no one to call him, and he'd overslept. I could hear him as he approached my room, with the intention of rousing me, and so I sat up in bed, the better to observe his translation. Perhaps apotheosis were a better term. He paused a moment on the threshold, then took the fatal step. Puff! It was like the wind sighing among the pines. He was gone. His clothes fell in a fantastic heap on the floor. Besides ozone, I noticed the faint garlic-like odour of phosphorus. A little pile of elementary solids lay among his garments. That was all. The wide world lay before me. My captors were no more.